Welcome, dear travelers of the night, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where history becomes a gentle lullaby and ancient worlds unfold like soft blankets around your weary soul. I'm your guide through the corridors of time, here to share with you the forgotten whispers of civilizations that once ruled the earth with bronze and iron, with wisdom carved in clay and stoned out tonight as the modern world settles into its restless sleep. We journey back more than 3,000 years to a land where mighty mountains cradle hidden valleys, where ancient winds still carry the echoes of royal chariots and the soft tapping of scribes working by lamplight. We travel to Anatolia, that bridge between Europe and Asia, where a people called the Hittites built an empire that would challenge the pharaohs of Egypt and leave messages in clay that would sleep buried for millennia, waiting for patient archaeologists to awaken their stories. Here at Mystic Bedtime Stories, we believe that the past holds gentle lessons for our present troubles, that the rhythm of ancient lives can slow our racing hearts and calm our worrying minds. So settle deeply into your pillows. Let your breathing slow to match the ancient cadence of ox-drawn carts traveling dusty roads, and allow yourself to drift back to a time when the world was younger, when mysteries were deeper, and when the night sky held the same constellations that watched over Hittite kings as they dreamed their imperial dreams. Close your eyes now, and let your mind's eye see not the rushing highways of today, but the winding mountain paths of ancient Anatolia. Feel the cool evening air that carries the scent of pine forests and the distant smoke of village hearths. Somewhere in this twilight landscape, partially buried beneath centuries of shifting earth and growing grass, lie the remains of Hattusa, once the beating heart of a civilization that few remember, yet which shaped the world we know today. The Hittites, those remarkable people who called themselves the children of the storm god, emerged from the mists of prehistory like figures from a half-remembered dream. They were not born into the gentle river valleys that cradled other ancient civilizations. No, they were forged in the highlands of Anatolia, where winters bite deep and summers blaze across rocky plateaus, where a people must be strong to survive and clever to thrive. Picture, if you will, the land that shaped them. Anatolia stretches like a great bridge between the familiar world of Europe and the mysterious realms of Asia. Its central plateau rises like a vast table of stone and earth, surrounded by mountain ranges that seem to touch the very sky. To the north, the Black Sea laps against rugged coasts. To the south, the Mediterranean sparkles in the ancient sunlight. And threading through this landscape, countless rivers carve their patient way through valleys that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires beyond counting. It was here, in this land of contrasts, that the Hittites learned the arts that would make them masters of the ancient world. They learned to work bronze when bronze was the king of metals, creating weapons and tools that gleamed like captured sunlight. But more than this, they would become among the first to unlock the secrets of iron, that darker, harder metal that would give its name to an entire age of human history. They learned to read and write, not just in their own tongue, but in the diplomatic languages of their time, creating archives that would preserve their thoughts and deeds for archaeologists to discover 30 centuries later. But tonight, as we begin our long, gentle journey through their story, let us not think of them as remote figures carved in stone relief. Let us imagine them as people much like ourselves, people who loved and worried, who celebrated victories and mourned defeats, who looked up at the same stars we see tonight and wondered about their place in the great tapestry of existence. Hittites called their empire the land of Hatti, and at its heart stood their great capital city of Hattusa, carved from the living rock of the Anatolian mountains. Imagine walking through its gates in the golden light of evening, when the day's heat is fading and the stone walls hold just enough warmth to comfort a weary traveler. The massive stones of the city walls rise like cliffs on either side of you, fitted together with such precision that not even a thin blade could slip between them. These are stones that have witnessed the passing of kingdoms, stones that remember the footsteps of kings and the whispered prayers of common folk, seeking the favor of gods whose names are now known only to scholars. As you walk deeper into this ancient city, your footsteps echo softly on worn stone pavements. The buildings around you rise in terraces up the hillsides, their walls built of the same massive stones as the city's defenses. Here lived the scribes who recorded the kings, words on tablets of clay, pressing their reed styluses into the soft earth to create the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform writing. Here lived the craftsmen who worked bronze and iron into objects of beauty and utility. Here lived the merchants who traveled the trade routes connecting the civilizations of the ancient world, bringing news from Egypt and Mesopotamia, from the Aegean islands and the steppes of Central Asia. But perhaps most remarkably, here lived a people who understood something that many of their contemporaries did not, something that would ensure their memory would survive even when their empire crumbled to dust. They understood the power of the written word. The Hittites were chroniclers of their own time, scribes of their own destiny. They wrote down their laws, their treaties, their royal correspondence, their religious ceremonies, even their personal letters. They created one of the most complete written records of any ancient civilization, a vast library carved in clay that would sleep in the ruins of their capital until archaeologists of the 20th century would finally learn to read their ancient script. Tonight, as we embark on our journey through Hittite history, we follow in the footsteps of those patient archaeologists who, working with brush and trowel under the Mediterranean sun, slowly uncovered the remains of this forgotten empire. We follow the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler, who in 1906 began the excavations that would reveal the royal archives of Hattusa. We follow the scholars who spent decades learning to read the ancient scripts, piecing together the puzzle of Hittite cuneiform, discovering that these clay tablets held not just administrative records, but epic poetry, religious hymns, historical chronicles, and personal correspondence that brings the ancient world to vivid life. Among the thousands of tablets discovered in the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists found something that no one had expected. They found copies of the world's first known peace treaty, signed between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II after their great battle at Kadesh. This treaty, carved in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to resolve conflict through diplomacy rather than endless warfare. It speaks to us across the centuries of a wisdom that our modern world still struggles to achieve, a recognition that true strength sometimes lies not in the sword, but in the carefully chosen word. The Hittites were a people of many contradictions, and perhaps this is what makes their story so compelling as we seek rest in our modern world. They were warriors who valued peace, conquerors who respected the cultures they encountered, innovators who carefully preserved ancient traditions. They built their empire with iron weapons and bronze-fitted chariots. Yet their greatest legacy may be the clay tablets that recorded their thoughts and dreams with such faithful detail that we can still hear their voices whispering across the centuries. As we settle more deeply into our exploration of their world, let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ancient life. There were no electric lights to banish the darkness in Hittite times, no engines to fill the night with mechanical noise. When the sun set over the Anatolian plateau, darkness fell like a soft blanket, broken only by the flicker of oil lamps and cooking fires. People lived by the rhythms of the natural world, rising with the sun and resting with the stars. Their lives were measured not in minutes and seconds, but in seasons and years, in the slow accumulation of wisdom and the patient building of lasting things. Let yourself drift back to that slower time, that world where patience was not just a virtue, but a necessity, where the greatest achievements required the work of generations, where the scribes who carved the royal chronicles knew that their words would outlast the buildings they worked in, outlast perhaps even the empire they served. Let the Hittites teach you something about the long view of history, about the comfort that comes from knowing that human civilization has weathered many storms and emerged to tell its stories to new generations of listeners. We begin our journey in the highlands of Anatolia, in a land where the wind carries the scent of pine and cedar, where ancient trade routes wend through mountain passes that have witnessed the passage of countless travelers. We begin with the earth itself, the rocky foundation upon which the Hittites built their remarkable civilization, and we will take our time, as they did, building their story layer by careful layer, like the massive stone walls of their great cities, built to last not just for years, but for millennia. So close your eyes now, dear listener, and let your modern concerns drift away like morning mist. Tonight, you are a traveler on the ancient roads of Anatolia, walking in the footsteps of Hittite merchants and soldiers, scribes, and kings. Tonight, the urgent demands of your daily life fade into the background, replaced by the deeper rhythms of human history, the slow and patient story of a people who built an empire from mountain stone and human will, who left us messages in clay that speak of their hopes and dreams, their victories and defeats, their profound understanding that true civilization is built not just with bronze and iron, but with words and wisdom, with law and justice, with the patient accumulation of human knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The Hittites await us in the mists of time, ready to share their stories with anyone willing to listen with a quiet heart and an open mind. Let us go now and meet them in their mountain kingdom, where the past still whispers in the wind and ancient stones still hold the warmth of the sun. Let your mind drift now across the vast expanse of Anatolia, that ancient land bridge between worlds, where the morning sun first touches the peaks of the Pontic Mountains in the north, then spreads its golden light across the central plateau, finally setting in glory over the Taurus Mountains that guard the southern approaches to this remarkable peninsula. This is a land shaped by the patient work of geological ages, where volcanic forces thrust mountains skyward and carved deep valleys, where rivers cut channels through solid rock and deposited fertile soil in hidden basins that would one day support great cities. Breathe deeply now and imagine the clean, thin air of the Anatolian highlands, scented with the resin of ancient forests and the wild herbs that carpet the mountain meadows in spring. This is not the gentle landscape of river valleys, where other civilizations first took root. This is a harder land, a testing ground that demanded strength and ingenuity from its inhabitants. The winters here bite deep, with snow that can bury entire villages for months at a time, as summers blaze with an intensity that can crack stone and turn streams to dust. Yet it was precisely this challenging environment that forged the character of the Hittite people, teaching them the virtues of endurance, adaptability, and careful planning that would serve them well when they began their conquest of neighboring lands. Picture the geography that would shape Hittite destiny. To the west, the Aegean Sea sparkles with islands that were home to the mysterious Minoan civilization, and later the emerging Greek city-states. To the east, the land rises toward the Armenian highlands and the distant mountains that separate Anatolia from the ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia. To the south, fertile coastal plains stretch along the Mediterranean, dotted with trading cities that connected Anatolia to the wider world of ancient commerce. And to the north, the Black Sea washes against rugged coasts where hardy fishermen and traders plied their ancient crafts. But it was the heart of Anatolia, that high central plateau, that would prove most crucial to Hittite success. Here, sheltered by mountain ranges from the worst extremes of weather, lay broad valleys and rolling plains perfect for raising the horses and cattle that would become the foundation of Hittite military power. Here grew the forests of oak and thorn, pine that would provide timber for construction and fuel for the great furnaces where Hittite smiths would perfect their metalworking arts. Here lay deposits of silver and iron ore that would finance and arm their expanding empire. The land taught the Hittites lessons that more fortunate peoples, blessed with easier climates and gentler terrain, never had to learn. It taught them the value of storing grain against the lean months, of building strong walls against both winter storms and human enemies, of maintaining careful relations with distant neighbors whose friendship might mean the difference between prosperity and starvation when harvests failed. The Anatolian landscape, with its isolated valleys connected by narrow mountain passes, created a natural school of diplomacy, where survival often depended more on negotiation than conquest. Water was precious here, not the endless abundance of great rivers like the Nile or Euphrates, but carefully hoarded streams and springs that had to be protected and shared according to ancient customs. The Hittites learned to build sophisticated systems of channels and cisterns to capture the spring snowmelt and summer rains, storing water against the dry months when every drop meant life or death for crops and livestock. These skills in water management would prove invaluable when they began administering their far-flung empire, helping them win the loyalty of subject peoples by improving their irrigation and water supply. The forests of Anatolia were another treasure that shaped Hittite civilization. Unlike the largely treeless landscapes of Mesopotamia and Egypt, Anatolia was rich in timber, providing not only building material and fuel, but also the raw material for one of the most important technologies of the ancient world, the spoked wheel chariot. The Hittites became master chariot builders, crafting light, fast vehicles that could carry their warriors swiftly across the battlefield, while serving as mobile platforms for their deadly composite bows. The chariots that would shake the ground at the great Battle of Kadesh were born in the forests of Anatolia, shaped by craftsmen who understood wood as their ancestors had understood stone. But perhaps most importantly, the challenging environment of Anatolia taught the Hittites to be innovators. When bronze became difficult to obtain because the trade routes were disrupted by war or political upheaval, they learned to work with iron, that more abundant but harder to master metal. When their traditional enemies developed new military tactics, they adapted and improved upon them. When changing political circumstances required new forms of diplomacy, they developed sophisticated treaty-making procedures that would influence international law for centuries to come. The seasonal rhythms of Anatolian life created a people who understood the importance of patience and long-term planning. Spring in the highlands was a time of careful preparation, when farmers repaired their tools and planned their planting, when warriors maintained their weapons and practiced their skills, when merchants prepared for the trading season that would connect them to markets across the known world. Summer was the time of action, when armies marched and crops were tended with constant vigilance against drought and pests. Autumn brought harvest and the gathering of resources for the long winter ahead, a time when communities drew together to share the work of preservation and storage. Winter was the season of reflection and planning, when old men told stories around hearth fires, and young people learned the crafts that would serve them in adulthood. This rhythm of preparation, action, harvest, and reflection would become characteristic of Hittite statecraft as well. They were a people who planned carefully before acting, who built their empire not through sudden conquest, but through patient accumulation of advantages, who understood that lasting power required not just military might, but also careful administration, diplomatic skill, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Let yourself imagine now a traveler of that ancient time, perhaps a merchant leading a caravan of laden donkeys through one of the mountain passes that connected the Anatolian heartland to the outside world. Feel the thin air burning in your lungs as you climb toward the pass, the excitement and apprehension that comes with approaching unknown territory. Behind you lies the familiar world of your home valley, with its known dangers and established customs. Ahead lies the uncertain path to foreign markets, where different languages are spoken and different gods are worshipped, where profit and loss, success and disaster are separated by the narrowest of margins that this traveler's journey captures. Something essential about the Hittite experience. They were a people always balanced between the familiar and the foreign, the secure and the uncertain. Their homeland gave them strength and identity, but their destiny lay in their ability to venture beyond its borders, to meet and master challenges that their mountain fastness could not prepare them for. They learned to be both rooted and adaptable, both proud of their heritage and open to learning from others. The geography of Anatolia made the Hittites natural bridge builders, both literally and figuratively. Their land connected Europe and Asia, and they learned to serve as intermediaries between very different civilizations, translating not just languages, but entire ways of thinking about politics, religion, and social organization. When they encountered the ancient urban civilizations of Mesopotamia, with their complex bureaucracies and elaborate temple hierarchies, they learned to adapt these sophisticated systems to their own needs. When they confronted the military power of Egypt, with its disciplined armies and advanced siege techniques, they studied and improved upon Egyptian methods. When they traded with the seafaring peoples of the Aegean, they learned new approaches to commerce and craftsmanship. The mineral wealth of Anatolia provided the foundation for Hittite prosperity and power. The mountains that made travel difficult also contained rich deposits of metals that were essential to ancient civilization. Silver mines in the Taurus Mountains provided the currency that financed Hittite expansion and diplomacy. Copper deposits, combined with imported tin to create the bronze that armed their early armies and filled their workshops with tools and ornaments. But most importantly, iron ore deposits in the Pontic Mountains would eventually provide the raw material for the iron weapons that gave the Hittites a crucial military advantage over their bronze-armed enemies. The mastery of iron working was perhaps the Hittites' greatest technological achievement, though it came only after generations of experimentation and failure. Iron is more abundant than copper and tin, the metals needed for bronze, but it is also much more difficult to work. The temperatures required to smelt iron are higher than those needed for bronze, and the metal is harder to cast and shape. Early iron was often inferior to good bronze, brittle and prone to breaking at crucial moments. But the Hittite smiths persevered, generation after generation, learning from the failures of their predecessors, gradually mastering the secrets of temperature control, alloy composition, and heat treatment that would make iron superior to bronze. They learned to add carbon to create steel, to quench hot iron in water or oil to harden it, to temper heated metal to achieve the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility. These techniques, developed in the mountain workshops of Anatolia, would eventually spread throughout the ancient world, ushering in the Iron Age that transformed human civilization. The strategic importance of iron working cannot be overstated. A kingdom that could arm its soldiers with iron weapons while its enemies still relied on bronze held an enormous military advantage. Iron weapons were not just harder and more durable than bronze ones. They were also much less expensive to produce once the techniques were mastered. A king could equip a much larger army with iron weapons than with bronze ones, shifting the balance of power toward those who commanded the new technology. The Hittites guarded their iron-working secrets jealously, treating the knowledge as a state secret of the highest importance. Letters found in the royal archives at Hattusa show that foreign rulers repeatedly requested iron weapons or iron-working experts from the Hittite kings, requests that were usually politely but firmly refused. The Hittites understood that their technological advantage would disappear once the knowledge spread, so they did everything possible to maintain their monopoly for as long as possible. Asterisk, the climate of Anatolia, with its hot, dry summers and cold, snowy winters, shaped not only Hittite agriculture and daily life, but also their religious beliefs and seasonal celebrations. The struggle between the life-giving forces of spring and summer and the death-dealing powers of autumn and winter became central themes in Hittite mythology, reflected in stories of gods who died and were reborn with the changing seasons. Festivals that celebrated the return of fertility to the earth, in rituals designed to ensure favorable weather for crops and herds. The storm god, chief deity of the Hittite pantheon, was intimately connected to the weather patterns that governed life in the Anatolian highlands. He was the bringer of the spring rains that awakened the earth from its winter sleep, the thunder that announced the summer storms that watered the crops, the terrible force of winter blizzards that could bury entire valleys under snow. The Hittites understood their dependence on forces beyond human control, and their religious practices reflected a deep respect for the power of nature and the need to maintain harmony between human activities and natural cycles. The goddess of fertility, known by various names but always associated with the earth's productivity, was equally important in Hittite religious thought. She was the force that caused grain to sprout and grow, that brought increase to flocks and herds, that blessed human families with children and prosperity. Her temples were found throughout Hittite territory, often built on hilltops or in sacred groves where the power of the goddess was believed to be particularly strong. These religious beliefs shaped Hittite attitudes toward their environment in ways that modern people might find surprisingly sophisticated. The Hittites understood that human prosperity depended on maintaining the fertility of the land, and their agricultural practices reflected a careful balance between exploitation and conservation. They practiced crop rotation to prevent soil exhaustion, maintained forests to prevent erosion and ensure adequate rainfall, and established sacred groves where no trees could be cut and no animals hunted. As our journey through Anatolia draws toward its close, let yourself feel the deep contentment that comes from understanding your place in the natural world. The Hittites learned to read the language of sky and earth, to time their activities according to the rhythm of seasons and weather, to live in harmony with forces far greater and more enduring than any human kingdom or empire. They understood that true wealth lay not in the accumulation of gold and silver, though they possessed both in abundance, but in the health of the land that supported them, and the wisdom to use its gifts without destroying its capacity for renewal. Landscape of Anatolia taught the Hittites patience, teaching them to think in terms of generations rather than years, to build for permanence rather than immediate gain, to value stability and continuity over rapid change and short-term advantage. These lessons served them well when they began to build their empire, helping them create administrative systems that could endure for centuries, diplomatic practices that maintained peace across vast distances, and cultural traditions that could adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential character. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, carry with you the peace of those ancient mountains, where time moves slowly and the urgent concerns of daily life fade into the larger rhythms of earth and sky. Let the wisdom of the Anatolian highlands calm your restless spirit, reminding you that you too are part of something larger than yourself, connected to the eternal cycles of nature and the enduring human quest for meaning and purpose. Sleep, now in the shelter of those timeless peaks, where the wind carries no urgency and the stars shine with the same gentle light that guided Hittite shepherds home to their mountain villages 3,000 years ago. Now, as the evening deepens and your breathing slows to match the eternal rhythms of the mountains, let us walk together through the gates of Hattusa, that marvel of ancient engineering and human ambition that served as the beating heart of the Hittite Empire for over 4 centuries. Close your eyes and feel the massive stones beneath your feet, stones quarried from the living rock of Anatolia and fitted together with such precision that they have endured the passage of 3 millennia, still standing as testimony to the vision and skill of their builders. Hattusa was not built in a day, nor even in a generation. Like all great cities, it grew slowly, organically, each ruler adding to the work of his predecessors, each generation contributing its own dreams and needs to the evolving urban landscape. The city that archaeologists discovered in the early 20th century represented the accumulated labor and imagination of countless workers, from the kings who conceived its grand design to the humble stonemasons who shaped each massive block with patient precision. Picture, if you will, the first Hittite king to recognize the strategic importance of this particular site in the bend of the Kizilirmak River, what the ancients called the Halles. Perhaps he stood on the rocky outcrop that would one day support the royal citadel, looking out over the natural amphitheater formed by the surrounding hills, and saw in his mind's eye not the scattered villages and pasturelands that then occupied the valley, but a great city that would dominate the trade routes of central Anatolia and serve as a worthy capital for the empire he dreamed of building. The location was chosen with the careful eye of a people who understood both the opportunities and dangers of their world. Hattusa commanded the approaches from the north and east, controlling access to the central Anatolian plateau and the rich agricultural lands beyond. A bend in the river provided natural protection on two sides, while the steep hills offered defensive advantages and elevated sites for temples and palaces that would proclaim the power and piety of the Hittite rulers to all who approached. The city. Let your imagination drift back to the early days of construction, when the first massive stones were hauled up the hillsides by teams of oxen and human workers, when the master builders laid out the foundations according to plans that existed only in their minds and in rough sketches on clay tablets. This was an age before cranes and mechanical lifting devices, when moving a single stone block required the coordinated effort of dozens of men and careful planning worthy of a military campaign. The walls of Hattusa were not merely functional fortifications, but works of art that proclaimed the greatness of the civilization they protected. Rising in some places to heights of more than 30 feet, these walls were constructed using a technique called Cyclopean masonry, fitting together massive irregular stones without mortar, each block carefully shaped to lock with its neighbors, in a puzzle of stone that would challenge even modern engineers to duplicate. The builders incorporated natural outcroppings of bedrock into their design, making the walls seem to grow organically from the living stone of the mountainside. But it was the gates of Hattusa that truly captured the imagination of ancient visitors and continued to inspire wonder in modern times. The Lion Gate, with its massive stone lions carved in relief on either side of the entrance, stood as a symbol of royal power and divine protection. These were not mere decorative elements, but sacred guardians, believed to possess the spiritual power to ward off enemies and evil influences. The lion's eyes, now weathered by millennia of wind and rain, once stared with fierce intensity at all who would enter the sacred precincts of the capital. Even more impressive was the King's Gate, where a relief sculpture of a Hittite warrior god still stands guard after more than 3,000 years. This figure, carved directly into the inner face of the gateway, shows the distinctive dress and weapons of Hittite nobility. His short tunic and pointed shoes, his curved sword and battle axe, his expression of calm confidence that speaks of a people secure in their power and proud of their military traditions. Within the walls of Hattusa, the city was laid out according to a careful plan that reflected both practical needs and religious beliefs. The upper city, built on the slopes of the surrounding hills, contained the great temples dedicated to the chief gods of the Hittite pantheon. Here stood the temple of the storm god, the supreme deity of the Hittites, a massive complex of stone buildings surrounding courtyards where priests conducted the elaborate rituals that were believed to maintain the favor of the gods and ensure the prosperity of the kingdom. The lower city, built on the more level ground near the river, contained the royal palace, The administrative buildings where the king's scribes recorded the laws and treaties that governed the empire, and the workshops, where skilled craftsmen produced the goods that made Hattusa famous throughout the ancient world. Here were the bronze foundries where weapons and tools were cast, the pottery workshops where storage jars and ceremonial vessels were shaped and fired, the textile workshops where fine fabrics were woven for royal use and foreign trade. The royal palace itself was a marvel of ancient architecture, a complex of interconnected buildings that served simultaneously as royal residence, government headquarters, and ceremonial center. The throne room, where foreign ambassadors were received and important state decisions were announced, was decorated with elaborate wall paintings and furnished with treasures gathered from across the known world. Here sat the Hittite kings on their throne of carved stone, surrounded by the symbols of their power, receiving the homage of vassals and the respect of equals. But Hattusa was not merely a showcase of royal power. It was also a living city where thousands of ordinary people carried on the daily business of life. In the residential quarters, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of houses where merchants and craftsmen lived with their families, where children played in small courtyards and women ground grain and baked bread in clay, ovens that still show the marks of ancient fires. These houses, built of the same massive stone as the royal buildings, but on a more human scale, remind us that Hattusa was home to a diverse community of people whose daily lives, while simpler than those of the royal court, were no less important. To the life of the city, the streets of Hattusa were paved with flat stones that provided sure footing for both pedestrians and the wheeled carts that brought supplies from the countryside. A sophisticated system of drains and gutters carried away rainwater and waste, while covered channels brought fresh water from springs in the surrounding hills. The city's engineers understood the importance of clean water and proper sanitation, creating infrastructure that would not be equaled in many parts of Europe until the modern era. Perhaps most remarkably, Hattusa was planned and built as an eternal city, designed to last not just for the lifetime of its builders, but for generations to come. The massive scale of its construction, the careful attention to drainage and foundation work, the use of the finest materials available, all speak of a people who thought in terms of centuries rather than years, who built not just for themselves, but for their children's children. As night falls over the ruins of Hattusa, as it has fallen for 3,000 years since the city was abandoned to the wind and weather, let yourself imagine the evening rituals that once marked the end of each day. Picture the priests climbing the steps to the temple of the storm god to offer the evening sacrifice, the smoke rising from sacred fires, the sound of hymns sung in the ancient Hittite language echoing from the stone walls of the sacred precincts dot in the royal palace. Imagine the king meeting with his advisors, discussing the reports that have arrived from the distant provinces of the empire, planning military campaigns or diplomatic initiatives, making the countless decisions required to govern a realm that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Euphrates River. In the scribal schools, picture young men learning to read and write in the complex cuneiform script, mastering not only their own language, but also the international languages of diplomacy and trade that would allow them to serve in the imperial administration. And in the houses of ordinary citizens, imagine families gathering for their evening meal, parents telling stories to their children, craftsmen teaching their skills to apprentices, the quiet conversations and gentle activities that have marked human life in every age and place. These people, whose names are mostly lost to history, whose individual stories were never recorded on the clay tablets that preserve the deeds of kings and gods, were the true foundation of Hittite civilization, the countless unnamed individuals whose daily labor and quiet lives made possible the achievements we remember today. Hattusa stands now as a monument to their collective achievement, a testament to what human beings can accomplish when they work together toward a common goal, when they combine individual skill and creativity with shared vision and mutual cooperation. The city that rises from the Anatolian hillside in massive stone terraces speaks to us across the centuries of the enduring human desire to create something beautiful and lasting, to build not just shelters for our bodies, but monuments to our highest aspirations. Let the peace of ancient Hattusa settle over you now like a soft blanket, the deep contentment of a city built to last, built to endure, built by people who understood that the greatest achievements require not just individual brilliance but collective effort sustained over generations. Sleep now in the shelter of those eternal walls, where time moves slowly and the urgent concerns of daily life fade into the larger rhythms of human history, where the stones themselves hold the memory of ancient dreams and the promise that what is built with love and skill and patient labor can endure long after its builders have returned to dust. The morning mist still clings to the ancient walls of Hattusa as we step deeper into this forgotten world. Can you feel it? That quiet reverence that settles over sacred places, where the echoes of ancient voices seem to whisper through the stone corridors. Here, in these weathered halls, lived kings who understood something profound about the permanence of words, about the power of preserving truth in clay. It would outlast bronze, outlast flesh, outlast even memory itself. Close your eyes and imagine walking through the royal archives of Hattusa. The afternoon sun filters through narrow windows, casting gentle shadows across row upon row of carefully organized clay tablets. Each one bears the distinctive wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay by scribes, whose hands moved with practiced precision. The tablets rest on wooden shelves, organized with a care that speaks to their immense value. These aren't mere records. They are the very thoughts, fears, triumphs, and wisdom of kings who ruled an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. The Hittites developed their own variation of cuneiform script, a system they adapted to serve their complex diplomatic and administrative needs. Archaeological expeditions to Hattusa have uncovered entire sets of royal archives written in both Akkadian, the diplomatic language of their time, and in the various dialects of the Hittite Confederation. Imagine the patience required, the dedication to truth and record-keeping that drove these ancient rulers to document their worlds so meticulously. Let us meet some of these remarkable kings, beginning with Hattusili I, whose name means he of Hattusa. Picture him in his later years, his weathered hands tracing the lines of a clay tablet as he dictates his political testament. His voice, though aged, carries the authority of one who has expanded his kingdom beyond the familiar highlands of Anatolia. He speaks slowly, choosing his words with care, knowing they will be preserved for generations yet unborn. Let my words be written truly, he might have said to his scribes. Let those who come after know how we built this kingdom, stone by stone, treaty by treaty, battle by battle. And they did right truly. His political testament, discovered centuries later among the ruins, reveals a king grappling with succession, with the weight of leadership, with the very human concerns of ensuring his life's work would continue beyond his death. The scribes who served these kings were more than mere secretaries. They were the guardians of memory, the weavers of history. Picture them in their quiet chambers, reed styluses in hand, transforming the spoken word into permanent symbol. Their workspace was sacred, filled with the tools of their trade, baskets of carefully prepared clay, reed pens cut to precise angles, reference tablets containing the complex rules of cuneiform grammar and diplomatic protocol. These kings authored massive archives of cuneiform tablets containing numerous ancient languages and sacred rituals. They understood that power wasn't just in the sword or the chariot, but in the written word that could travel across continents and survive the rise and fall of dynasties. Consider Mursili I, who led his armies deep into Mesopotamia, all the way to Babylon itself. The tablets tell us he was young when he accomplished this remarkable feat, but they also reveal his struggles with internal rebellion, with the constant challenge of holding together a diverse empire. His scribes recorded not just his victories, but his setbacks, his negotiations, his careful diplomatic maneuvering. They wrote of his attempts to balance the competing interests of local nobles, of his efforts to maintain the delicate web of alliances that kept his empire stable. The clay tablets speak of late nights in the royal chambers, where kings would pace back and forth, dictating letters to distant rulers. Picture Suppiluliuma I, perhaps the greatest of the Hittite kings, composing correspondence that would be carried by swift messengers across hundreds of miles. His letters, preserved in clay, reveal a mind of remarkable diplomatic sophistication. He writes to the Pharaoh of Egypt with formal respect, but there's an underlying confidence, a quiet assertion of equality that must have made quite an impression in the courts of the ancient world. During the Late Bronze Age, Akkadian functioned as the international language of diplomacy, and many of the Hittite tablets represent correspondence between Hittite kings and their vassal states or foreign kingdoms. These weren't simple messages, but complex negotiations involving trade rights, territorial boundaries, marriage alliances, and mutual defense agreements. In one particularly touching series of tablets, we find the correspondence between a Hittite king and an Egyptian queen. She writes to him after the death of her husband, expressing her loneliness and her fear of being forced into an unwanted marriage. She asks for one of his sons to marry, to become Pharaoh of Egypt. The Hittite king's response is careful, diplomatic, but also surprisingly compassionate. He understands the precarious position of a royal widow, the political pressures she faces. His scribes capture not just the formal language of diplomacy, but hints of genuine human concern. The tablets also reveal the Hittite king's deep engagement with law and justice. They didn't simply rule by decree, but developed sophisticated legal codes that were carefully recorded and preserved. Picture King Telepinu working with his advisors to codify the laws of succession, to establish procedures that would prevent the civil wars that had plagued earlier reigns. His edict, inscribed on clay, establishes principles of royal succession that prioritize stability over arbitrary power. These legal tablets are remarkable for their humanity. Unlike some ancient law codes that relied heavily on harsh punishments, the Hittite laws often sought compensation rather than vengeance. They protected the rights of slaves, established procedures for divorce that considered the welfare of women, and created mechanisms for resolving disputes without bloodshed. The scribes who recorded these laws worked by lamplight, their careful script preserving not just legal procedures, but the moral vision of kings who understood that true power lay in justice, not in forced dot as night falls over ancient Hattusa. Imagine the royal scribes working late into the evening, their reed pens moving steadily across wet clay surfaces. They record the day's diplomatic correspondence, the king's judicial decisions, the reports from provincial governors, the accounts of the royal treasury. Each tablet represents hours of careful work, each symbol a small act of preservation against the erosion of time. The Hittite tablet collections functioned as living archives, with new kings often maintaining their predecessors' records, while adding their own, creating an unbroken chain of documentation that could span generations. These weren't static repositories, but dynamic collections that grew and evolved with each reign, each diplomatic crisis, each legal precedent. The most remarkable aspect of these royal archives is their scope. The Hittite kings didn't just record their own actions, but preserved the voices of their subjects, their enemies, their allies. They kept copies of treaties signed with rival kingdoms, records of tribute payments, accounts of religious ceremonies, even personal letters between members of the royal family. They understood that history is not just the story of kings, but the complex interweaving of countless individual lives and choices. Picture Queen Padduhepa working alongside her husband Hattusa III, adding her own voice to the royal archives. She corresponds directly with foreign rulers, negotiates religious agreements, oversees complex diplomatic protocols. Her letters, preserved in clay, reveal a woman of remarkable intelligence and political acumen, actively shaping the policies of the empire. The scribes who recorded her words treated them with the same reverence they accorded to the kings, understanding that wisdom and authority could flow from many sources. As we near the end of our journey through these ancient archives, take a moment to appreciate the profound faith these kings had in the power of the written word. They lived in an age where most communication was oral, where news traveled slowly, where the collapse of a kingdom could erase its memory entirely. Yet they chose to invest enormous resources in preserving their thoughts, their decisions, their very humanity in fragile clay tablets. Hugo Winkler, the German archaeologist who rediscovered Hattusa, eventually unearthed an entire library containing thousands of clay tablets, bringing the voices of these ancient kings back to the world after centuries of silence. When he first began to decipher these tablets, he was reading the actual words of kings who had been dead for over 3,000 years, their thoughts as clear and immediate as if they had been written yesterday. The gentle sound of reed pens. On clay, the soft murmur of scribes reading their work aloud for accuracy, the measured pace of royal dictation. These sounds once filled the quiet chambers of Hattusa. Now, as moonlight falls across the ancient ruins, we can almost hear those voices again, whispering across the centuries, reminding us that the desire to be remembered, to have our words outlive our bodies, is perhaps the most human desire of all. And so the clay tablets rest in their modern museums, these humble vessels carrying the thoughts of kings across an ocean of time, proof that sometimes the most powerful empires are built not of stone and bronze, but of words carefully chosen and faithfully preserved. In the silence of the archive, in the patience of the scribe, in the hope of the king that his words might matter to generations yet unborn, we find something timelessly beautiful about the human desire to communicate across the great distances of time and space. Let that thought carry you gently into sleep, like the soft sound of ancient scribes working late into the night, preserving the voices of the past for the dreamers of tomorrow. The scent of wood smoke and glowing metal drifts through the evening air as we step into the workshops of ancient Hattusa. Here, in the heart of the Hittite capital, master craftsmen have gathered around their forges, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of charcoal fires that burn steadily through the night. The rhythmic sound of hammers on metal creates a gentle percussion, like a lullaby made of bronze and flame, telling the story of a civilization that understood the deep connection between fire, metal, and power. Listen carefully, and you can hear the whisper of bellows breathing life into the coals, the soft hiss of hot metal meeting water, the satisfied murmur of craftsmen examining their work by lamplight. These are the sounds of innovation, of secrets being forged in fire and shaped by skilled hands that understood mysteries other kingdoms could only dream of. The Hittites were masters of bronze, that golden alloy that gave its name to an entire age of human civilization. Picture the royal armories of Hattusa, where ranks of bronze weapons gleamed in the torchlight. Swords with hilts wrapped in leather and gold, their blades carrying the characteristic blue-green patina of aged bronze. Spearheads sharp enough to pierce the strongest armor, their points catching the light like captured stars. Battle axes with crescent-shaped blades, perfectly balanced for the swing of a warrior's arm. But it was not just the weapons themselves that made the Hittites formidable. It was their understanding of metallurgy that set them apart from their contemporaries. The Hittites developed specialized forging methods to produce weapons that reflected their advanced understanding of combining natural resources with metalworking techniques. Their bronze was not simply copper mixed with tin, but a carefully calibrated alloy adjusted for specific purposes. Harder bronze for weapon edges, softer bronze for decorative elements. Each mixture the result of generations of experimentation and refinement. The workshops of Hattusa were places of both craft and science. Picture the master smith examining a piece of copper ore by firelight, his experienced eye reading the subtle variations in color and texture that would tell him how much tin to add, how long to heat the mixture, when to begin the delicate process of shaping. His apprentices watched in respectful silence, learning not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. For the Hittites understood that metalworking was not merely about creating tools, but about transforming the very substance of the earth through controlled fire and patient skill. The secrets of their bronze working were closely guarded, passed down through generations of craftsmen who formed something like guilds within Hittite society. These were not just workers, but artists and engineers who understood the molecular transformation that occurred when copper and tin were heated together, even if they would not have used such modern terms. They knew that temperature, timing, and technique could mean the difference between a blade that would shatter at first contact and one that would serve a warrior through dozens of battles. Yet, as remarkable as their bronze working was, it is the whispers of iron that truly intrigue. U.S. For the Hittites lived on the very edge of the Iron Age, at that mysterious moment in history when humanity first began to unlock the secrets of this more challenging metal. The development of iron smelting was once attributed to the Hittites of Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age, though modern scholarship suggests the reality was more complex and gradual than once believed. The truth about Hittite iron is as mysterious as it is fascinating. X-ray fluorescence spectrometry suggests that most or all irons from the Bronze Age are derived from meteorites. Picture the wonder of discovering such celestial metal, fallen from the heavens like gifts from the gods themselves. These meteorites, scattered across the Anatolian highlands, contained iron of extraordinary purity, already smelted by the cosmic forces that had created them in the hearts of distant stars. The Hittite craftsmen who first worked with meteoritic iron must have felt they were handling something sacred. Here was metal that had traveled through the void of space, that had been forged in stellar fires beyond imagination, now cooling in their earthly workshops. The hammering of meteoritic iron created a sound different from bronze, a deeper, more resonant tone that seemed to echo with the vastness of space itself. But the Hittites were not content to rely solely on the random gift of falling stars. The dominant metallurgical device of the Bronze Age was the charcoal fire pit, or bloomery. This consisted of a cupola-shaped pit filled with charcoal and wood. These bloomeries, carefully designed and tended, could achieve temperatures high, enough to begin the process of smelting iron from terrestrial ore. The process was far more demanding than bronze working, requiring higher temperatures, longer heating times, and a more intimate understanding of the relationship between fire, air, and metal. Picture the master ironworkers of Hattusa working through the night, feeding their bloomeries with carefully selected charcoal, adjusting the flow of air through primitive bellows, watching for the telltale signs that indicated when the iron was ready. The process was as much art as science, requiring an intuitive understanding of fire and metal that could only be gained through years of patient experimentation. The Hittites may have been able to produce and work iron, but production was too limited to support the mass markets demanded for designation as an Iron Age. The iron they created was precious, reserved for the most important weapons and tools. A king might possess an iron dagger, a symbol of his connection to the divine forces that had granted humanity this celestial metal. High-ranking warriors might carry iron spearheads, their weapons literally forged from star metal, carrying the power of the cosmos into battle. The workshops where this iron was forged were sacred spaces, places where earth and heaven met in the controlled fury of the forge. The craftsmen who worked there were not merely smiths, but priests of metallurgy, guardians of secrets that could reshape the balance of power among nations. They worked in small groups, their knowledge passed down through carefully chosen apprentices, their techniques protected by oaths of secrecy. But it was not just their metallurgy that made the Hittite military formidable. The Hittite chariots fit 3 soldiers. This allowed one man to drive the chariot and allowed 2 more effectively as soldiers and focus their efforts on warfare. These were not just vehicles, but mobile platforms for destruction, each one representing a convergence of technologies. That included not just metalworking, but woodworking, leatherworking, and a sophisticated understanding of animal training and battlefield tactics. The construction of a Hittite chariot was a masterpiece of engineering that required the coordination of multiple craftsmen. The wheelwrights who shaped the spoked wheels, the carpenters who built the lightweight but sturdy frames, the metalworkers who created the bronze fittings that held everything together, the leather workers who crafted the reins and harnesses. Each chariot represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, and the loss of even one in battle was a significant economic and tactical setback. These swift and maneuverable vehicles allowed Hittite forces to outpace slower infantry units, providing significant tactical advantages on the battlefield. Picture them thundering across the plains of Anatolia, their bronze-shod wheels throwing up clouds of dust, their crews working in perfect coordination. The driver, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes scanning the battlefield for opportunities and threats. Behind him, 2 warriors, one holding a shield, the other drawing back a bow, their bronze arrowheads gleaming in the sunlight. The psychological impact of these chariots was as important as their tactical effectiveness. Their mighty infantry and thundering chariots were the dread of the battlefield. At times they could muster as many as 50,000 men. The sound of hundreds of chariots approaching at full gallop must have been terrifying to enemy infantry. The ground shaking beneath their feet, the air filled with the thunder of hooves and wheels, and the war cries of the Hittite warriors. Yet for all their martial prowess, the Hittite craftsmen understood that true strength came not just from superior weapons, but from the patient mastery of their craft. In the quiet hours after battle, when the chariots had been returned to their stables and the weapons cleaned and oiled, the craftsmen would gather in their workshops to examine what had been damaged, what had performed well, what could be improved. They would run their hands along the edge of a bronze sword, feeling for the tiny nicks that indicated where the blade had struck bone or stone. They would examine chariot wheels for signs of stress, looking for the hairline cracks that might indicate a weakness in the wood or the bronze fittings. Each piece of equipment was not just a tool of war, but a repository of knowledge, a lesson in the ongoing conversation between human skill and the raw materials of the earth. As the night deepens around the forges of Hattusa, the fires burn lower but never die completely. The master craftsmen know that some processes cannot be rushed, that certain temperatures must be maintained through the long hours of darkness. They take turns watching the flames, adjusting the flow of air, adding charcoal when needed, their movements as rhythmic and meditative as a sacred dance. The apprentices sleep on beds of straw near the workshops, their dreams filled with the sounds and smells of the forge. They dream of the day when they too will be master craftsmen, when their hands will shape metal with the same confidence and skill as their teachers. They dream of the secrets they will learn, the mysteries of fire and metal that will be revealed to them through years of patient study and practice. And in the deepest part of the night, when even the most dedicated craftsmen have dozed off beside their cooling forges, the metal itself seems to whisper its secrets. The bronze weapons resting on their racks, slowly cooling from the heat of the day's work. The iron tools, still warm from the forge, carrying within their crystalline structure the memory of the stars from which they came. This is the legacy of the Hittite craftsmen, the inheritance they left to all who would come after. Not just the techniques of metalworking, but the understanding that true mastery comes from patience, from respect for the materials, from the willingness to learn, from both success and failure. In the gentle glow of the forge fires, in the careful hands of the master craftsmen, in the dreams of the apprentices who would carry these traditions forward, we find the true secret of Hittite power. And so we leave the workshops of Hattusa, carrying with us the memory of flames and metal, of secrets forged in fire and shaped by skilled hands. The sound of hammers on anvils fades into the distance, but the legacy remains, a reminder that true strength is not just in the weapons we create, but in the knowledge and skill we pass on to those who will come after us. The morning mist rises from the Orontes River as we journey south from the familiar highlands of Anatolia, following the ancient paths that lead to the crossroads of empires. Here, in the fertile plains of Syria, two great civilizations are about to collide in what history would remember as one of the most magnificent and futile displays of Bronze Age warfare. The year is 1274 before the Common Era, and the stage is set for the largest chariot battle the world has ever known. Listen to the gentle murmur of the river as it flows past the ancient city of Kadesh, its waters carrying the morning light like scattered silver coins. This strategic fortress, perched on a hill overlooking the vital trade routes between north and south, has become the focal point of a conflict that has been brewing for generations. Two empires, Egyptian and Hittite, each claiming dominion over the same lands, each convinced that their gods have ordained them to rule this crossroads of civilizations. In the Egyptian camp, the great pharaoh Ramesses II, barely 30 years old but already convinced of his divine destiny, prepares for what he believes will be his greatest triumph. Picture him in his royal tent as the first light of dawn filters through the silk walls, his servants helping him don the golden armor that catches and reflects the morning sun. His confidence is absolute, his certainty unshakable. He has brought with him the combined might of Egypt, 4 great divisions named after the gods themselves: Ammon, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. But across the plains, hidden in the pre-dawn shadows, King Muwatalli II of the Hittites has laid a trap of extraordinary cunning. The Hittite king understands that battles are won not just with bronze and courage, but with patience and deception. He has concealed his massive army east of Kadesh, keeping them invisible to Egyptian scouts, while sending false intelligence through carefully chosen spies who allow themselves to be captured by the advancing Egyptians. The deception is perfect in its simplicity. 2 Bedouins, seemingly frightened refugees, approach the Egyptian advance guard with a story calculated to inflame Pharaoh's ambitions. They speak of Hittite cowardice, of King Muwatalli retreating far to the north, leaving Kadesh virtually undefended. It is exactly what Ramesses wants to hear, confirmation of his own propaganda about Hittite weakness and Egyptian superiority. As the sun climbs higher, the Egyptian divisions become strung out along the road to Kadesh. The Am division, with Ramesses himself at its head, advances rapidly toward what they believe is an easy victory. Behind them, separated by miles of dusty road, the other divisions follow at a more leisurely pace. The pharaoh's eagerness has become his weakness, his confidence a trap that the Hittites have set with masterful precision. But then, in the heat of the Syrian afternoon, the truth reveals itself with devastating suddenness. 2 more spies are captured, but these are genuine Hittite scouts, and under interrogation they reveal the terrible reality. The Hittite army has not retreated. Instead, 2,500 Hittite chariots lie hidden just beyond the next hill. The largest chariot force ever assembled, ready to strike at the scattered Egyptian divisions. Picture the moment when this news reaches Ramesses. The confident smile fades from his face as he realizes the magnitude of his error. His army is divided, his forces scattered across miles of territory, and the most powerful military machine of the ancient world is about to fall upon him like a bronze-tipped avalanche. In that instant, the young pharaoh faces the possibility, not just of defeat, but of complete annihilation. The Hittite attack comes with the force of a summer storm. From behind the hills east of Kadesh, the thunder of thousands of hooves and wheels grows louder until it fills the world. The ground trembles beneath the weight of the approaching chariots, each one carrying 3 warriors, as was the Hittite custom. The dust cloud they raise blots out the sun, and the air fills with the clash of bronze and the war cries of men who have trained their entire lives for this moment. The surprise is complete and devastating. The Hittite chariots slam into the Egyptian Ra division like a bronze fist, scattering the infantry, overturning their lighter 2-man chariots, sending horses and men tumbling in a chaos of dust and blood. The Egyptian formation dissolves almost instantly, soldiers fleeing in panic toward the river, their bronze shields and spears abandoned in their desperate flight to safety. It is believed to be the largest battle ever fought involving chariots. Numbering at a total of 5,000 to 6,000, the sound is like nothing heard before or since. The rolling thunder of thousands of wheels, the screaming of horses, the clash of bronze on bronze, the shouts of drivers, and the war cries of warriors. The very air seems to vibrate with the intensity of the collision. For a moment, it seems that the Egyptian empire itself might collapse on this dusty plain. The Hittite chariots, their bronze-rimmed wheels crushing everything in their path, drive toward the Ammon division, where Ramesses himself stands with his bodyguard. The pharaoh's own survival hangs in the balance, and with it, the fate of one of history's greatest civilizations. But then, in the midst of this chaos, something remarkable happens. After being outmaneuvered, ambushed, and surrounded, Ramesses II personally led a charge through the Hittite ranks with his bodyguard. Picture the young pharaoh, golden armor gleaming, raising his war cry above the din of battle, his royal chariot cutting through the enemy ranks like a ship through storm waves. It is a moment of pure courage, or perhaps desperation, as Ramesses realizes that his only hope lies not in retreat, but in the kind of bold action that becomes legend. His bodyguard, the elite warriors who have sworn to die for their king, form around him in a wedge of bronze and determination. Together, they plunge into the heart of the Hittite formation, seeking not just survival, but the kind of spectacular victory that pharaohs require to maintain their divine status. The tide of battle shifts with bewildering speed. Muwatallis then brought into action another Hittite force of 1,000 chariots and attempted 6 successive charges. However, these were driven off as additional Egyptian forces arrived on the scene, and the Hittites suffered heavy losses. The arrival of the Ptah division, racing to the sound of battle, transforms what seemed like certain defeat into desperate stalemate. There was a day of carnage as some 5,000 chariots charged into the fray, but no outright victor. The battle rages through the afternoon, a swirling melee of chariots and infantry, bronze weapons flashing in the dust-filled air. Warriors who had trained since childhood in the arts of war find themselves pushed to the very limits of their skill and endurance. The heat of the Syrian sun beats down on the combatants, adding its own torment to the chaos of battle. Horses foam at the mouth from exhaustion, their drivers hoarse from shouting commands. The wounded crawl toward whatever shade they can find, while the dead lie scattered across the plain like broken dolls, their bronze armor now monuments to the futility of imperial ambition. As evening approaches, both armies pull back, exhausted, bloodied, neither able to claim the decisive victory their kings had demanded. The Hittites withdraw to their fortified positions, while the Egyptians, their formations shattered but their core strength intact, prepare for another day of fighting that both sides now dread. But the second day brings not renewed battle, but the first tentative steps towards something unprecedented in the ancient world. The next day Mu'atalis may have agreed to a truce, recognizing that further fighting would only weaken both empires without bringing victory to either. Despite facing overwhelming odds, Ramesses' tactics and use of light chariots prevented a decisive defeat, though the battle ended in a stalemate. The young pharaoh had survived his first great test, but at a cost that would haunt both empires for years to come. Thousands of their finest warriors lay dead on the plains of Kadesh, their chariots broken, their dreams of glory buried in the Syrian dust. Yet from this mutual exhaustion, something beautiful would eventually emerge. 16 years after the battle, in 1259 BCE, the two kingdoms realized there was no victory in sight for either. Instead, they put aside their warring past and proposed binding articles of peace known today as the Treaty of Kadesh. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, also known as the Eternal Treaty or the Silver Treaty, was concluded between Ramesses II of the Egyptian Empire and Khatuvili III of the Hittite Empire around 1259 BC. It is the oldest known surviving peace treaty in human history, a document that would become the foundation for all future diplomatic agreements between nations. Picture the ceremony where this treaty was signed, not on a battlefield strewn with corpses, but in the quiet dignity of royal chambers where scribes carefully inscribed the terms of peace on silver tablets. Each king was gifted a silver tablet of the treaty, a gleaming symbol of their mutual recognition that some victories are too costly to pursue, that some conflicts can only be resolved through wisdom rather than warfare. The treaty itself is a marvel of diplomatic sophistication, establishing principles that would echo through the centuries. It creates mutual defense agreements, regulates the return of refugees, establishes procedures for the succession of rulers, and most remarkably, declares that the two great powers will never again make war upon each other. The scribes who drafted this document were creating something new in human history, a legal framework for peace that transcended the personal ambitions of kings. In the years that followed, the treaty would prove more durable than any of the bronze weapons that had clashed at Kadesh. Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusa III would exchange letters, arrange marriages between their children, and create a stable peace that would last for the remainder of their reigns. The young pharaoh, who had nearly lost his empire in a moment of reckless ambition, would become one of history's greatest builders, channeling his energies into monuments that still inspire wonder today. The Hittite king, too, would find that peace brought rewards that victory never could. The resources once devoted to endless warfare could now be directed toward trade, toward the arts, toward the quiet prosperity that comes when nations turn their attention from destruction to creation. And in the quiet hours of evening, when the last light fades over the plains where so many had died, we can imagine the veterans of both armies gathering to share their memories. Egyptian and Hittite warriors, no longer enemies but fellow survivors of that terrible day, might sit together around their campfires, speaking in the universal language of those who have faced death together and found it wanting. They would remember the thunder of the chariots, the clash of bronze on bronze, the moment when it seemed the world itself might end in dust and blood. But they would also remember what came after, the slow recognition that some conflicts have no winners. Only survivors who are wise enough to choose peace over perpetual war. The Battle of Kadesh became the foundation for the first peace treaty in recorded history, a document that recognized the fundamental truth that great civilizations are measured not by their capacity for destruction, but by their wisdom in choosing when to lay down their arms and seek a better way forward. As night falls over the ancient battlefield, the wind carries away the dust of ages, but the lesson remains. In the end, the greatest victory was not won by any king or army, but by the quiet scribes who transformed the bitter lessons of war into the silver words of lasting peace. And in that transformation, we find something eternally hopeful about the human capacity to learn, to grow, and to choose wisdom over warfare when the moment calls for it. Let that thought accompany you into sleep, like the gentle murmur of the Orontes River carrying its ancient waters toward the sea, bearing with it the memory of a battle that taught the world its first great lesson about the possibility of peace. The evening mist settles across the high plateau of Anatolia, and in the distance, thunder rolls gently through the mountain valleys. It is here, among these weathered stone chambers and forgotten temples, that we must pause to understand the sacred heart of the Hittite world. For the people of this ancient empire were not merely warriors and traders, craftsmen and kings. They were believers, touched by something profound that connected their daily lives to forces far greater than themselves. In the quieting hours of twilight, when the work of the day was done and families gathered around their hearth fires, the Hittites would turn their thoughts skyward. They lived beneath a vast dome of heaven that seemed alive with presence, with power, with the breath of gods who could bring life-giving rain or devastating storms with equal ease. These were not distant, unknowable deities dwelling in some remote paradise. These were gods who walked among the mountains, who rode the thunder clouds, who felt the same fierce love for this rugged land that the Hittites themselves possessed. At the center of their divine pantheon stood Teshub, the mighty weather god whose very name seemed to echo with the rumble of approaching storms. Teshub wielded thunder, lightning, and rain, controlling the weather elements that determined whether crops would flourish or fail. Picture him, if you will, as the Hittites did, a powerful figure standing atop the storm clouds, his triple thunderbolt held high like a blazing trident, his beard flowing like the rushing wind. He wielded a triple thunderbolt as a symbol of his power and was depicted riding a bull, that great sacred animal whose strength seemed to mirror the raw force of the tempest itself. But Teshub was more than a bringer of storms. As the weather god of Hatti, he became the chief deity of the official pantheon, a great figure who bestowed kingship and brought victory. When a Hittite king stood before his armies, or sat in judgment in his royal hall, he did so with the understanding that his authority flowed from this ancient lord of the heavens. The thunder that rolled across the Anatolian sky was not merely a natural phenomenon. It was the voice of Teshub himself, speaking approval or warning to those below. Yet for all his masculine power, Teshub shared his divine throne with another, one whose light touched the hearts of the Hittite people with equal reverence. This was Erina, the sun goddess, whose golden presence warmed more than just the earth beneath their feet. Arinidi was the Hittite sun goddess, the principal deity, and patron of the Hittite empire and monarchy. In some accounts, she held even higher honor than her storm god consort, suggesting roots that reached back to the very earliest days of Anatolian civilization, when the divine feminine held sway over these mountain peoples. Each morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the walls of Hattusa, the Hittite king would begin his day with prayers to Erina. Kings acted as her priests, performing daily prayers at sunset, while queens served as her priestesses. Imagine these quiet moments of devotion, the ruler of a vast empire, surrounded by all the trappings of earthly power, bowing his head in humble recognition of the goddess whose light made all life possible. This close association between the monarchy and the goddess reinforced the divine foundation of royal authority, ensuring that the king's rule was seen as sanctioned by the gods. The city of Erina itself, a day's march from Hattusa, was perhaps the major cult center of the Hittites, and certainly of their major sun goddess. Picture this sacred place as it might have appeared 3,000 years ago. White limestone temples catching the morning light, their walls carved with solar discs that seemed to pulse with warmth even in the shadows. Major temples dedicated to her existed in Arena and Katuka, where rituals and offerings, including solar discs and animal sacrifices, were performed. The worship of Arena was interwoven with the rhythm of the seasons themselves. Reference to the city of the sun. Goddess is found in texts of the Hattusa, or the spring festival, mentioned in Hittite cuneiform writings. It was the most ancient spring festival celebrated in the region of Anatolia. When the long Anatolian winter finally loosened its grip and the first green shoots appeared in the valleys, the people would gather for great processions, carrying banners that caught the strengthening sunlight like captured flame. One of the most important festivals in honor of Arena was the Sun Festival, which celebrated the arrival of spring and the renewal of life. But the Hittite understanding of the divine extended far beyond these two great figures. Their pantheon was rich and diverse, influenced by neighboring cultures such as the Hurrians and Mesopotamians. This was not a narrow, exclusive faith, but rather a generous and inclusive spiritual landscape that welcomed gods from across the ancient world. Similar to other kingdoms at the time, the Hittites had a habit of adopting gods from other pantheons that they came into contact with, such as the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. Consider what this reveals about the Hittite character. Here was a people confident enough in their own spiritual traditions to welcome foreign deities, wise enough to recognize divine truth wherever it appeared. When Hittite merchants returned from distant lands with tales of powerful gods and goddesses, the royal scribes would carefully record these accounts, studying how these foreign deities might find a place within their existing sacred order. Was a remarkable example of religious tolerance and adaptability, centuries before such concepts became common in human civilization. The spiritual life of ordinary Hittites was rich with ritual and meaning. Records found in cult inventories show that local cults and practices were also active. Traditions and the status of local cults were constantly changing due to the lack of a national standard for ritual practice. In mountain villages and farming communities across the empire, families maintained their own connections to the divine through customs passed down through generations. Perhaps a particular grove was sacred to a local spirit, or a spring was thought to carry the blessing of a water goddess, whose name was never written in any royal chronicle, but lived on in the whispered prayers of village mothers. The role of sacred animals in Hittite religion speaks to their deep connection with the natural world around them. The deer held a pivotal role in the sun goddess's cult, their graceful forms representing the gentle, nurturing aspects of Arena's power. Bulls, with their raw strength and vital energy, served Teshub as both symbol and sacred companion. These were not mere representations, but living embodiments of divine presence, creatures through which the gods chose to manifest their power in the physical world. The temple ceremonies themselves must have been magnificent spectacles that engaged all the senses. Ceremonies often took place in front of 8 statues, each representing a previous high-ranking priestess. These rituals were elaborate and designed to honor the sacred feminine aspect. Picture the scene: great stone chambers filled with the smoke of burning incense, the walls lined with carved figures of priestesses whose faces had been worn smooth by centuries of devoted touch. The number 8 held special significance, representing completeness and divine order, while the presence of these ancient feminine figures connected each ceremony to an unbroken chain of sacred tradition stretching back to the very foundations of Hittite civilization. For the common people, religion was not a distant or abstract concept, but a living presence woven into every aspect of daily life. Arena would give power and victory to the king, and would equally give strength, success, and healing to the common man who stood in worship before her. A farmer struggling with poor crops might journey to her temple with offerings of grain and honey, while a mother seeking protection for her children would light oil lamps in the pre-dawn darkness, their small flames serving as earthly echoes of the great solar fire above. The prayers preserved on clay tablets give us intimate glimpses into these ancient hearts. Queens like Hattusa poured out their fears and hopes in words that still carry emotional power across the millennia, speaking to their goddess with the same mixture of reverence and desperate human need that has characterized prayer in every age. These tablets reveal people grappling with the same eternal questions that occupy human hearts today. How do we find meaning in suffering? How do we protect those we love? How do we maintain hope when the future seems uncertain? As the night deepens over these ancient lands, and the stars emerge in their eternal patterns above the Anatolian plateau, we can almost hear the echoes of those long-ago prayers drifting on the mountain wind. The temples may be ruins now. There, carved stones weathered by time and weather, but something of the faith that built them seems to linger still. It speaks of a people who understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to divine forces that moved through storm and sunlight, through the changing seasons and the turning of the years. In their understanding of the sacred, the Hittites achieved something remarkable, a spiritual vision that honored both the awesome power of the divine and the intimate needs of the human heart. Their gods were not remote tyrants demanding slavish obedience, but active participants in the ongoing drama of existence, beings who cared about justice and mercy, about the prosperity of communities and the protection of the innocent. The thunder still rolls across these mountains when storms gather, and the sun still rises each morning to warm the ancient stones. Perhaps in the whisper of wind through the ruins and the play of light on weathered carvings, something of that old understanding remains. The gods of the Hittites may no longer receive formal worship, but the human longing they answered for connection, for meaning, for hope in the face of uncertainty continues as strong as ever. And so, as we prepare to journey deeper into the heart of Hittite civilization, let us carry with us this understanding of their spiritual world. For it was this faith, more than their bronze weapons or stone fortifications, that gave them the strength to build an empire and the wisdom to govern it with justice. In their temples and their prayers, in their festivals and their quiet moments of devotion, we see reflected the eternal human quest to touch something greater than ourselves, to find in the vast cosmos not emptiness but presence, not indifference but love. In the quiet archives beneath the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists discovered something remarkable among the thousands of clay tablets that once formed the royal library. These were not merely records of conquests or tributes, not genealogies of kings or hymns to distant gods. Instead, they found what may be one of humanity's earliest and most compassionate legal codes, written in the careful cuneiform script of royal scribes who understood that true strength lay not in harsh punishment, but in the gentle art of justice tempered with mercy. The Hittite laws speak to us across the millennia with a voice that seems surprisingly modern, surprisingly humane. In an age when many civilizations ruled through fear and brutality, when the strong simply took what they wanted from the weak, the Hittites chose a different path. Their legal code reveals a society that valued restoration over revenge, rehabilitation over retribution, and the protection of the vulnerable over the absolute power of the privileged. Picture, if you will, the scene in which these laws might have been applied, not in some harsh tribunal where accused persons trembled before merciless judges, but rather in community gatherings where elders sat in circles, their weathered faces reflecting the wisdom earned through decades of observing human nature. The provisions require cooperation rather than vengeance or imprisonment for offenses. This was revolutionary thinking for its time, suggesting that crime was not simply evil to be punished, but a problem to be solved through mutual understanding and community healing. The treatment of slaves under Hittite law reveals perhaps the most striking aspect of their legal philosophy. Although they were considered lesser than free men, the slaves under the code were allowed to choose whomever they wanted to marry. buy property, open businesses, and purchase their freedom. In an ancient world where slavery was an accepted institution, where human beings were often treated as mere property to be bought and sold, the Hittites recognized something fundamental about human dignity that many later civilizations would forget. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A slave in the Hittite Empire could accumulate wealth, could make choices about their personal life, could build a future for their family. Under the laws, slaves were not treated as human chattel, or property that could be used and abused by their masters, however they saw fit. This was not charity or occasional kindness, but legal protection encoded in the very structure of their society. It suggests a people who understood that brutality corrupts both the victim and the perpetrator, that a society built on cruelty ultimately weakens itself. The rights granted to women under Hittite law were equally progressive for their time. The Hittite law codes offer more protection for a woman than Victorian England, in the sense that a Hittite woman could both initiate a divorce and keep her inheritance and half her husband's estate if she divorced. This is a startling comparison, suggesting that in some ways, women in ancient Anatolia enjoyed more legal protection than their sisters would possess thousands of years later in supposedly more civilized times. The ability of a Hittite woman to initiate divorce proceedings was revolutionary. In most ancient societies, marriage was essentially a transfer of property from father to husband, with the woman having little say in the matter. But Hittite law recognized that marriage was a partnership that could be dissolved when it no longer served both parties. Among other things, she had the legal right to disinherit her sons if they failed to take care of her. This provision reveals a society that valued the wisdom and authority of older women, recognizing their contributions and ensuring their security in their later years. The complexity of Hittite thinking about issues of consent and protection can be seen in their laws regarding rape and assault. While their understanding differed from modern concepts, they showed awareness of the importance of context and vulnerability in determining guilt and punishment. A woman far from home, without the protection of family and community, was recognized as being in a position of particular vulnerability, deserving of legal protection that took her circumstances into account. When we examine the broader structure of Hittite law, we see a legal system that sought to maintain social order, not through fear, but through a careful balance of justice and mercy. Cases in which capital punishment is recommended in the articles were surprisingly few, reserved for the most serious crimes that threatened the very fabric of society. More commonly, penalties involved restitution, compensation, or other forms of restoration that sought to heal the harm caused, rather than simply inflicting pain in return. The careful preservation of these laws across multiple copies suggests their importance to Hittite society. Many copies have survived, 4 from the Old Kingdom alone. These maintain the collection with little or no change. This consistency across time indicates that these were not merely royal decrees issued on a whim, but fundamental principles that the Hittites believed were essential to maintaining a just society. In the evening hours, when disputes arose in Hittite communities, when neighbors quarreled over boundaries or merchants disagreed about contracts, these laws provided a framework for resolution that emphasized understanding over punishment. The legal process itself seems to have been designed to bring people together rather than drive them apart, to find solutions that all parties could accept rather than simply declaring winners and losers. The laws also reveal fascinating details about daily life in the Hittite Empire. Laws regulating prices show us a government concerned with economic fairness, while provisions about marriage between different social classes demonstrate a society grappling with questions of mobility and social change that remain relevant today. These were not abstract principles carved in stone, but practical guidelines for living together in a complex, diverse society. The spiritual dimension of Hittite law cannot be overlooked. In a civilization where the king served as both political ruler and high priest, where divine approval was essential for earthly authority, the law was seen as more than mere human convention. It was understood as reflecting divine will, as an earthly expression of cosmic order. This gave the legal system a moral authority that went beyond mere power, creating a framework where even rulers were subject to principles greater than their own desires. The gentle nature of Hittite justice becomes even more remarkable when we consider the harsh realities of ancient warfare and diplomacy. These were people who could be fierce warriors when necessary, who built an empire through military conquest and maintained it through political skill. Yet in their internal governance, they chose compassion over cruelty, restoration over revenge. It suggests a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, a recognition that lasting peace comes not from suppression, but from justice fairly administered. As night settles over these ancient lands, as the stars emerge above the ruins of courts where these gentle laws once held sway, we can perhaps hear echoes of those long-ago proceedings in the whisper of wind through broken stones. The voices of judges seeking wisdom, of community members working together to solve problems, of ordinary people finding protection and dignity within a legal system that treated them as human beings rather than mere subjects. The clay tablets that preserve these laws have given us a gift across the millennia, a glimpse into a society that chose a different path from many of its contemporaries. In their careful balance of authority and compassion, in their protection of the vulnerable, and their emphasis on restoration over retribution, the Hittites created something that speaks to the best impulses of human civilization. The Hittite laws reflected the empire's social structure, sense of justice, and morality, addressing the common challenges of human society with wisdom that still resonates today. In our own time, as we struggle with questions of justice and mercy, of how to create legal systems that serve all members of society fairly, we might find inspiration in these ancient voices that spoke so eloquently for human dignity and the possibility of gentle governance in a harsh world. The legacy of Hittite law reminds us that strength need not be brutal, that authority can be exercised with compassion, that true civilization is measured not by the magnificence of its monuments, but by the kindness of its justice. In the quiet reading of these ancient statutes, preserved for us in the patient cuneiform of royal scribes, we find evidence of human beings at their best, creating structures that protected the weak, elevated the oppressed, and sought always to heal rather than to harm. The soft glow of oil lamps illuminates a quiet chamber deep within the royal palace of Hattusa, where scribes work through the long hours of night, their styluses moving carefully across wet clay tablets. These are not chronicles of battles or inventories of treasure, but something far more precious and revealing. Letters that would travel hundreds of miles across ancient trade routes, carrying the hopes, fears, and carefully crafted words of one of history's most sophisticated diplomatic networks. In this age of bronze and early iron, when kingdoms rose and fell with the speed of seasonal storms, the Hittites understood something profound about the nature of lasting power. They knew that while armies could conquer territory, it was diplomacy that could win hearts, secure borders, and create the kind of enduring relationships that would outlast any individual ruler. Their mastery of international relations was not merely practical politics, but an art form that combined wisdom, patience, and an almost modern understanding of what we today might call soft power. The discovery of the Amarna letters in 1887 opened a window into this ancient world of diplomatic correspondence that still takes our breath away. These 382 clay tablets, written primarily in Akkadian cuneiform, represent some of the oldest diplomatic documents ever found, preserving conversations between the great powers of the late Bronze Age. Kings addressed each other using carefully chosen familial terms that indicated their relative status. My brother for equals, my father for superiors. creating a complex hierarchy of respect and recognition that governed international relations across the ancient Near East. At the heart of this diplomatic world stood the remarkable figure of Queen Paduepa, whose personal correspondence with Pharaoh Ramesses II reveals the human side of ancient statecraft. Theirs was a genuine partnership of equals, with Hittite law and custom allowing queens considerable latitude, though few took every inch of that power the way Paduepa did. She communicated personally with Ramesses II, calling him brother, and addressing Queen Nefertari as sister, establishing relationships that transcended mere political necessity to become something approaching genuine friendship. Picture the scene as one of these diplomatic tablets was being composed. The queen sits in her private audience chamber, sunlight filtering through high windows as she dictates to her most trusted scribe. Her words must be chosen with infinite care, for they will be read not only by their intended recipient, but by the learned advisors who surround every ancient throne. Each phrase must convey respect without subservience, strength without aggression, friendship without weakness. In one surviving letter, she thanks the pharaoh for his gifts, while indicating she sent gifts of her own, assuring him she will give him her daughter in marriage to bind the two kingdoms, though practical concerns about ongoing warfare meant the customary elaborate dowry could not be provided. The complexity of these marriage alliances reveals the sophistication of Hittite diplomatic strategy. Paduepa orchestrated marriages not only between her daughters and foreign rulers, but also arranged matches for her sons with princesses from Amurru and Babylon, creating a web of family connections that spanned the known world. These were not merely political arrangements, but carefully crafted bonds designed to create lasting peace through the most intimate of human connections. The correspondence between the Hittite and Egyptian courts gives us glimpses into the delicate dance of ancient diplomacy. After 15 years of futile attempts at regaining lost territory in Syria, Ramesses appears to have realized that his opportunities to match the military achievements of earlier pharaohs were unrealistic, making diplomatic victory increasingly important. This pragmatic acceptance of limitations, shared by both sides, created the foundation for what would become one of history's most enduring peace agreements. The practical aspects of maintaining these international relationships required enormous resources and careful organization. Diplomatic missions traveled for weeks across dangerous terrain, carrying not only letters, but also the gifts that were essential to ancient diplomacy. These exchanges of gifts reinforced status differences, with smaller states' offerings understood as tribute to their superiors, while between equals, the gifts served as symbols of mutual respect and continuing friendship. The language of the diplomacy itself was fascinating, conducted primarily in Akkadian, which served as the international language of the ancient Near East, much as French would later serve European courts, or English serves global business today. Hittite scribes had been masters not only of their own complex writing system, but also of this foreign tongue, capable of expressing the subtle nuances of their rulers, intentions in words that would be clearly understood hundreds of miles away. Beyond the grand gestures of royal correspondence, Hittite diplomacy extended to the practical management of trade relationships, border disputes, and the countless smaller issues that arise when different peoples live in proximity. The royal archives contained detailed records of commercial agreements, extradition treaties, and protocols for handling refugees and political exiles. This comprehensive approach to international relations suggests a bureaucracy of remarkable sophistication, capable of managing multiple complex relationships simultaneously. The role of women in Hittite diplomacy was particularly progressive for its time. Queens like Paduepa were not merely ceremonial figures, but active participants in statecraft, conducting their own correspondence and negotiations. This recognition of female diplomatic capability gave the Hittites additional flexibility in their international relationships. allowing them to appeal to foreign queens and princesses in ways that were unavailable to more rigidly patriarchal societies. The religious dimension of Hittite diplomacy cannot be overlooked. Treaties were sworn before the gods of both parties, creating sacred bonds that transcended mere political convenience. When diplomatic marriages were arranged, elaborate rituals ensured that the foreign princess would be welcomed not only into her new family, but also into the spiritual community of her adopted homeland. This integration of religious and political concerns created diplomatic relationships with a depth and durability that purely secular agreements could not match. The careful preservation of diplomatic archives reveals how seriously the Hittites took their international commitments. Modern scholars have access to more than 50 documents from what might be called the Foreign Office of the Hittite Empire, including 20 treaties, 17 diplomatic letters, and 17 royal edicts dealing with relationships between the Hittites and their various allies and vassals. This meticulous record-keeping suggests a culture that valued consistency and reliability in its international dealings. The geographic position of the Hittite Empire made diplomatic skill essential for survival. Surrounded by powerful neighbors and controlling crucial trade routes between Asia and Europe, the Hittites could not rely solely on military might to maintain their position. They needed the kind of nuanced understanding of international relationships that could navigate the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and shifting power balances that characterized their world. The legacy of Hittite diplomacy extends far beyond their own time and place. In their careful balance of strength and restraint, their recognition that lasting peace required genuine mutual benefit, and their understanding that successful international relationships must address both practical concerns and human emotions, they established principles that remain relevant to modern diplomacy. Their treaty with Egypt included provisions for mutual defense against Assyrian invasion, showing an understanding of collective security that would not look out of place in contemporary international law. As the evening deepens over these ancient lands, as the stars emerge above the ruins where these diplomatic masterpieces were once composed, we can almost hear the whisper of stylus on clay, the careful consultation between ruler and scribe, the patient work of building understanding across the vast distances of the ancient world. The clay tablets that preserve these conversations have given us a precious gift, evidence that even in humanity's earliest civilizations, there were those who understood that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the true, patient art of making enemies into friends. In their diplomatic correspondence, the Hittites showed us that true strength lies not in the ability to impose one's will upon others, but in the wisdom to find solutions that serve everyone's interests. Their letters, traveling across deserts and mountains to reach distant courts, carried more than mere words. They carried the hope that human beings, despite all their differences, could find ways to live together in peace. That hope, preserved in the patient cuneiform of ancient scribes, continues to inspire those who work for understanding in our own troubled times. The wind carries whispers across the highland plateaus of Anatolia tonight, soft murmurs that speak of endings and beginnings, of how even the mightiest empires can dissolve like morning mist when the sun rises. Listen closely to the gentle rustle of leaves in ancient oak groves, where once the hoofbeats of Hittite messengers thundered along stone-paved roads. It was around the year 1200 before the Common Era when something extraordinary happened in the ancient world. Not a single catastrophic event, but rather a slow unraveling, like watching a magnificent tapestry come apart thread by thread. The great Hittite Empire, which had stood for nearly 5 centuries as a pillar of Bronze Age civilization, began to fade from history in ways that still puzzle scholars today. Picture, if you will, the last known Hittite king, Sapalulima II, sitting in his palace at Hattusa as twilight settled over the Anatolian highlands. Perhaps he gazed out from his stone windows toward the distant mountains, unaware that he would be remembered as the final ruler of a dynasty that had corresponded with pharaohs and commanded respect from Babylon to the Mediterranean shores. Collapse did not come with the dramatic thunder of armies at the gates, though armies there certainly were. Instead, it arrived like a fever that slowly weakens the body, making it vulnerable to ailments that would normally be easily overcome. The empire that had once stretched its influence across much of modern-day Turkey began to fragment. Its carefully maintained network of vassal states and allied cities starting to slip away like sand through outstretched fingers. One of the most haunting aspects of this collapse was how thoroughly it erased not just the political structure, but the very memory of Hittite greatness. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was sacked and burned, and the Hittite state fragmented into smaller Neo-Hittite kingdoms. The great archives, those thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets that recorded treaties, letters, laws, and royal decrees, were abandoned in the ruins of burning buildings. It was as if the very voice of an entire civilization suddenly went silent. Modern scholars have proposed several theories for this mysterious disappearance, each as compelling as it is incomplete. Some point to climate data suggesting that a severe multi-year drought occurred around 1198 to 1196 BCE, coinciding with the Hittite collapse. Imagine the gradual drying of wells that had sustained communities for generations, the withering of crops in fields that had fed the empire's armies, the slow migration of people searching for water and fertile ground. This drought would have been more than an inconvenience. It would have been catastrophic for a civilization dependent on agriculture and trade. Rivers that once carried merchant boats laden with grain and precious metals became shallow streams. Trade routes that connected Anatolia to the rich markets of Mesopotamia and Egypt became dangerous paths through increasingly desperate and hostile territories. Then there were the mysterious sea peoples, a group of tribes hypothesized to have attacked Egypt and other eastern Mediterranean regions around 1200 BC. These weren't necessarily a single unified force, but rather various groups of displaced peoples, perhaps themselves fleeing from droughts, famines, or political upheavals in their own lands. They are held responsible for the destruction of old powers such as the Hittite Empire, though the truth may be more complex than simple invasion and conquest. Picture caravans of families with their possessions loaded onto ox-drawn carts, moving across the landscape like slow-moving rivers of humanity. Some came peacefully, seeking new homes and opportunities. Others came with bronze weapons and desperate hunger, ready to take by force what they could not obtain through trade or diplomacy. The settled urban centers of the Hittite Empire, with their granaries and workshops, would have appeared as islands of prosperity in an increasingly chaotic world. But even this explanation feels incomplete when we consider the thoroughness of the collapse. Competing theories of the cause of the late Bronze Age collapse have been proposed since the 19th century, with most involving the violent destruction of cities and towns. These include climate change, volcanic eruptions, droughts, disease, invasions by the sea peoples, economic disruptions, and various combinations of these factors. Perhaps the truth lies not in any single cause, but in the perfect storm of multiple crises arriving simultaneously. Consider how a prolonged drought would have weakened the empire's ability to maintain its armies, making it vulnerable to external threats. Economic disruption would have followed as trade routes became unsafe and agricultural production declined. Internal rebellions might have erupted as local governors found themselves unable to rely on support from the central authority in Hattusa. Two may have played its silent role. In a world without modern medicine, where cities were connected by bustling trade routes, epidemic diseases could spread with devastating efficiency. A plague that began in one corner of the empire could have reached every major city within months, leaving behind weakened populations and disrupted social structures. The psychological impact of such cascading failures would have been profound. The Hittite Empire had maintained its power through a carefully balanced system of treaties, tributes, and military deterrence. When that system began to fail, when vassal states stopped paying tribute and neighboring kingdoms sensed weakness, the empire's authority would have unraveled with shocking speed. Imagine the conversations in Hattusa's royal council chambers during those final years. Officials arriving with increasingly dire reports from the provinces. Granaries running low, tax revenues declining. Messages from distant governors requesting military support that could no longer be provided. The king and his advisors watching. Their carefully maintained world dissolve, perhaps wondering if the gods had turned their faces away from the Hittite people. There's something deeply moving about contemplating how quickly greatness can fade from human memory. Within a few generations of the empire's collapse, the Hittites had become little more than a vague memory preserved in the writings of their former enemies and allies. The Egyptians remembered them, the Assyrians knew of them, and they appeared as distant figures in biblical texts. But their own voice, their own story told in their own words, lay buried beneath the rubble of Hattusa and the smaller cities that had once proudly called themselves Hittite. The smaller Neo-Hittite kingdoms that emerged from the empire's fragments carried on some traditions, some artistic styles, some memories of former glory. But they were like echoes of a great song, beautiful in their own way, but forever reminded of the grander melody they could no longer fully recall. These successor states would themselves eventually be absorbed by the expanding Assyrian Empire. The final threads connecting the present to the great Hittite past gradually severed as we drift towards sleep tonight. Consider the impermanence that touches even the greatest human achievements. The Hittite scribes, who so carefully recorded their kings' victories on clay tablets, believed they were preserving their stories for eternity. They could not have imagined that their empire would become so thoroughly forgotten that 19th century. Scholars would debate whether the Hittites had ever really existed at all. Yet there's something comforting in knowing that time eventually reveals its secrets. The clay tablets that lay buried for 3 millennia eventually spoke again when archaeologists learned to read their cuneiform script. The massive stone blocks of Hattusa's walls still stand, testament to the skill and ambition of their builders. The iron weapons that gave Hittite armies their edge, once carefully guarded state secrets, rest in museum cases where anyone can marvel at their craftsmanship. The wind that blows across the Anatolian plateau tonight carries the same wild freedom it carried in 1200 BCE, when the last Hittite settlements were being abandoned and their inhabitants scattered to find new homes in a changing world. It reminds us that while empires rise and fall, while civilizations emerge and fade, the natural world continues its ancient rhythms, patient and enduring. In the gentle darkness of this late hour, let the story of the Hittite collapse become not a tale of tragedy, but of transformation. Their political empire may have vanished, but their innovations in metalworking, their legal traditions, their diplomatic practices, all these flowed onward into subsequent civilizations. They became part of the great river of human knowledge and experience, invisible individually, but essential to the whole. Sleep now, and dream of highland winds carrying the whispers of ancient peoples across the centuries, their voices joining. The eternal conversation between past and present, their stories becoming part of the vast human memory that connects us all across the spans of time and space. In the gentle twilight of this evening, let us journey to a moment when sleeping giants stirred beneath the Turkish soil, when voices that had been silent for 3,000 years suddenly began to whisper their ancient secrets once more. The year was 1906, and the world was about to rediscover one of its lost civilizations through the patient work of archaeologists armed with little more than brushes, trowels, and an insatiable curiosity about the past. Picture the remote village of Bagascale in central Turkey, where shepherds had long wondered about the massive stone blocks scattered across the hillsides. For generations, local people had used these ancient stones to build their homes and walls, never imagining they were handling fragments of palaces where kings once held court with pharaohs and emperors. The wind that swept across these highlands carried no hint of the treasures that lay buried just beneath the surface of the earth. That it was here that a German scholar named Hugo Winkler arrived with his small team of excavators, drawn by reports of mysterious ruins that might hold clues to the ancient world. Winkler was no ordinary treasure hunter. He was a linguist and historian who understood that the greatest treasures were not gold or silver, but the words and thoughts of people who had lived centuries before. He came seeking not riches, but stories that, as the first shovelfuls of soil were carefully removed and brushed away, the past began to emerge like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom. Stone foundations appeared, then walls, then gateways carved with the figures of lions and sphinx that had stood guard over this place when Rome was still a collection of villages on 7 hills. But it was what Winkler's team found inside, the ruins that would truly change our understanding of the ancient world. Room after room revealed caches of clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked and stored with the careful organization of a great library. These cuneiform tablets, eventually numbering around 30,000, contained the royal archives of the Hittite Empire. Each tablet was like a time capsule, preserving in hardened clay the daily concerns, grand strategies, and intimate thoughts of people who had walked these halls 3 millennia earlier. Imagine the excitement as Winkler discovered more than 10,000 tablets inscribed with cuneiform Akkadian, but in an unknown language, a language that scholars would eventually identify as Hittite. These were not random scraps of ancient writing, but organized archives, containing everything from royal correspondence to legal codes, from religious ceremonies to trade agreements. It was as if the Hittite bureaucracy had simply stepped away from their desks one day, leaving their paperwork behind for future generations to discover. The clay tablets spoke in many voices. Some contained the stern words of kings issuing decrees to distant governors. Others preserved the careful language of diplomats negotiating treaties with neighboring powers. Still others captured the ritual words of priests conducting ceremonies to ensure the favor of the gods. Each tablet was a window into a different aspect of Hittite life, and together they painted a picture of a sophisticated civilization that had been virtually unknown to the modern world. Among the most important discoveries were official correspondence and contracts, as well as legal codes and procedures for cult ceremonies. These weren't just historical documents. They were the living records of how an empire actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. The tablets revealed the Hittites as master diplomats who maintained complex relationships with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria through carefully worded letters and strategic marriages. One particularly fascinating aspect of the discovery was how these tablets connected to finds made elsewhere. The unknown language matched a set of 2 letters previously discovered in 1887 during excavations in Amarna in Egypt. Suddenly, mysterious documents from the Egyptian archives made sense. They were letters from Hittite kings to Egyptian pharaohs, part of a diplomatic correspondence that spanned the ancient world. The process of deciphering these tablets was like solving a puzzle that spanned decades. Scholars worked carefully through the cuneiform script, comparing it to known Akkadian and Sumerian texts, gradually unlocking the grammar and vocabulary of the Hittite language. Each translated tablet revealed new pieces of the historical puzzle, filling in gaps in our knowledge of the Bronze Age world that had persisted for centuries. As more tablets were translated, the Hittites emerged from obscurity as a major power of the ancient world. The archives contained copies of the peace treaty with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh, revealing details about one of history's first recorded diplomatic agreements. There were letters between royal families discussing marriages, alliances, and the exchange of gifts that cemented political relationships across vast distances. The religious texts were equally revealing, showing a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses, elaborate rituals, and a sophisticated understanding of divine kingship. The legal codes demonstrated a relatively humane approach to justice, with detailed provisions for protecting the rights of various social classes, including slaves and foreigners. These weren't primitive people struggling to survive, but members of a complex civilization with well-developed institutions and cultural traditions. The tablets, which were included in the UNESCO World Documentary Heritage in 2001, provide rich information about the history, society, economy, and religious traditions of the Hittites. This recognition acknowledges their importance not just as historical artifacts, but as part of humanity's shared cultural heritage. Documents that help us understand our collective past. The excavations at Hattusa continued long after Winkler's initial discoveries. German institutions conducted excavations between 1906 and 1911, 1931 to 1939, and from 1951 until today. Each season brought new discoveries, new tablets, new insights into Hittite civilization. The work became a multi-generational effort, with successive teams of archaeologists carefully uncovering and documenting the remains of this ancient capital. What makes this story particularly moving is how completely the Hittites had been forgotten, and how dramatically their rediscovery changed our understanding of the ancient world. Before Winkler's excavations, historians knew of the Hittites mainly from brief mentions in Egyptian records and biblical texts. They were shadowy figures on the margins of ancient history, people whose own voices had been lost to time. The clay tablets changed all that. Suddenly, the Hittites could speak for themselves, in their own words, about their own concerns and achievements. The archives revealed them as equals to the great powers of their time, participants in the complex diplomatic and military relationships that shaped the Bronze Age world. They were no longer footnotes in other people's stories, but the authors of their own remarkable chapter in human history. Consider the profound patience required for this kind of archaeological work. Each tablet had to be carefully excavated, documented, photographed, and then slowly translated by scholars who spent years learning to read the ancient script. Some tablets were complete, preserving entire documents from beginning to end. Others were fragments that had to be pieced together like three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles, with scholars sometimes working for decades to reconstruct a single important text. The emotional impact of these discoveries cannot be overstated. Imagine holding in your hands a letter written by a Hittite king to the Pharaoh of Egypt, knowing that you are the first person to read these words in over 3,000 years. The clay that preserved these messages had been shaped by human hands in the Bronze Age, fired in kilns that warmed the workshops of Hattusa, and then buried by the destruction that ended the Hittite Empire. Even today, new discoveries continue to emerge from the soil of Turkey. Recent excavations have uncovered tablets describing invasions and conflicts, adding new chapters to our understanding of the empire's final years. Each new find reminds us that there are still voices waiting to be heard, still stories preserved in clay tablets that lie buried beneath the earth. The rediscovery of the Hittites teaches us something profound about the nature of human memory and forgetting. Civilizations that seem permanent and eternal can vanish so completely that later generations doubt they ever existed. Yet, given time and patient effort, their voices can be recovered, their stories can be told again, their contributions to human civilization can be recognized and celebrated. As you settle into sleep tonight, think about those thousands of clay tablets resting in museums and research institutions around the world, each one a messenger from the deep past. Think about the Hittite scribes who pressed their styluses into wet clay, never dreaming that their routine record-keeping would someday allow their civilization to live again in the minds and hearts of people separated from them by 3 millennia. The wind that blows across the ruins of Hattusa tonight carries the same wildness it carried when Hittite kings walked those stone pathways. But now it also carries something new, the knowledge that human voices, once lost, can speak again across the vast spans of time. In the gentle darkness of this late hour, let that thought bring you comfort, that nothing truly important is ever completely forgotten, that patient hands and curious minds can always recover what seemed lost forever. Sleep now and dream of patient archaeologists with their brushes and trowels, of scholars bent over ancient tablets in lamplight, of the moment when ancient words suddenly make sense and the past comes alive again. Dream of voices speaking across the centuries, preserved in clay and waiting for the right moment to tell their stories once more. As the gentle darkness of evening settles around us, let us explore how the ancient Hittites have lived on in the modern world, not just as archaeological discoveries and scholarly studies, but as figures that continue to capture the human imagination. Their story bridges the gap between historical fact and the realm of legend, between dusty clay tablets and the vivid pages of contemporary literature. Long before archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Hattusa, the Hittites existed as shadowy figures in one of humanity's most influential texts. The Hittites are mentioned more than 50 times in the Bible, appearing in stories that have been told and retold for thousands of years. In these ancient narratives, they appear as neighbors and sometimes adversaries of the Israelites, woven into the fabric of biblical history in ways that kept their name alive even when their empire was forgotten. Consider the story of Abraham purchasing a burial plot for his wife Sarah from Ephron the Hittite, a tale that appears in the book of Genesis. This simple transaction, recorded in careful detail, preserves a moment of human interaction across cultures and centuries. The biblical Abraham speaks respectfully with Ephron, negotiating the purchase of the cave of Machpelah with the dignity befitting 2 men of standing in their communities. This story, told in synagogues and churches for millennia, kept the Hittite name alive in human memory, even during the long centuries when their empire lay buried beneath Turkish soil. There's something deeply moving about how for many years, critics of the Bible treated the Hittites as proof of the mythology contained in the Bible, reasoning that since they had no archaeological evidence of a Hittite civilization, it must never have existed. The irony is profound. The very text that preserved their memory was doubted because physical evidence of their existence had been lost. It wasn't until the archaeological discoveries, beginning in 1876, that the biblical references were vindicated, showing how oral and written traditions can sometimes preserve historical truths that material evidence has obscured. In these biblical narratives, the Hittites appear as a people with their own distinct identity, sometimes as individuals with names and personalities. Uriah the Hittite, the loyal soldier whose tragic fate became entangled with King David's story, represents perhaps the most humanized Hittite figure in ancient literature. His character embodies honor and duty, qualities that have resonated with readers across cultures and centuries, dot the transition from biblical mention to modern. Imagination has been gradual but fascinating. As the 19th and 20th centuries brought archaeological discoveries that confirmed the historical existence of the Hittite Empire, writers and artists began to see them not just as minor biblical characters, but as representatives of a sophisticated ancient civilization worthy of exploration. In their own right, modern literature has embraced the Hittites with particular enthusiasm. Novels like Ben Bova's The Hittite and Janet E. Morris's I, the Sun have brought Hittite characters and settings to contemporary audiences, weaving historical research into compelling narratives that make the ancient world accessible to modern readers. These works represent a fascinating collaboration between archaeological scholarship and literary imagination, where clay tablets become the foundation for epic tales of love, war, and political intrigue. The appeal of the Hittites to modern storytellers lies partly in their position as a civilization that was both historically significant and relatively unknown to general audiences. Unlike Egypt or Rome, which have been extensively portrayed in popular culture, the Hittites offer writers a chance to explore an ancient world that feels both authentic and fresh. Their rediscovery in the 20th century means they carry an air of mystery and revelation that resonates with contemporary sensibilities. In historical fiction, works like Joanne Williamson's Hittite Warrior have introduced younger readers to this ancient civilization, often focusing on the human stories that unfold against the backdrop of great historical events. These narratives typically emphasize the universal themes of courage, loyalty, and the search for identity that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. The Hittites have also found their way into academic literature in ways that blur the line between scholarship and storytelling. Researchers writing about Hittite culture often adopt narrative techniques that bring their subjects to life, describing not just what happened, but how it might have felt to live through these ancient events. The careful reconstruction of daily life in Hittite society, based on archaeological evidence and cuneiform texts, becomes a form of collective biography that honors both historical accuracy and human imagination. Contemporary artists have been drawn to Hittite imagery and themes as well. The distinctive art style of the Hittite reliefs, with their powerful figures and symbolic animals, has influenced modern sculptors and painters seeking to connect with ancient traditions of artistic expression. Museums displaying Hittite artifacts often note how visitors are struck by the immediacy and emotional power of these ancient works, suggesting that artistic communication can transcend the boundaries of time and culture. The archaeological romance of the Hittite discoveries has itself become a subject of modern storytelling. The image of scholars like Hugo Winkler uncovering tablets that had been buried for 3 millennia captures the imagination in ways that speak to our deep human desire to recover lost knowledge and reconnect with our ancestral past. These stories of discovery often emphasize the patience and dedication required for archaeological work, celebrating the quiet heroism of scholars who spend their lives piecing together fragments of the past. In the realm of popular culture, the Hittites represent a particular type of ancient mystery that appeals to modern audiences. Unlike civilizations that have left obvious monuments like pyramids or colosseums, the Hittites left behind primarily written records and the ruins of their capital city. This emphasis on words and documents rather than spectacular architecture creates a different kind of fascination, one that focuses on the interior lives and thoughts of ancient people rather than their monumental achievements. The digital age has created new opportunities for Hittite stories to reach wider audiences. Online communities of history enthusiasts share theories about Hittite society, debate the meanings of newly translated texts, and create their own fictional works inspired by Hittite themes. Educational websites and YouTube channels dedicated to ancient history have introduced the Hittites to millions of people who might never have encountered them. Through traditional academic channels, documentary filmmakers have found the Hittite story particularly compelling because it combines multiple elements that make for engaging viewing: archaeological mystery, international intrigue, and the human drama of rediscovery. The visual contrast between the harsh Anatolian landscape and the landscape, sophisticated artifacts uncovered there, creates a powerful backdrop for exploring themes of civilization, decline, and renewal. As the gentle darkness of evening settles around us, let us explore how the ancient Hittites have lived on in the modern world, not just as archaeological discoveries and scholarly studies, but as figures that continue to capture the human imagination. Their story bridges the gap between historical fact and the realm of legend, between dusty clay tablets and the vivid pages of contemporary literature. Long before archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Hattusa, the Hittites existed as shadowy figures in one of humanity's most influential texts. The Hittites are mentioned more than 50 times in the Bible, appearing in stories that have been told and retold for thousands of years. In these ancient narratives, they appear as neighbors and sometimes adversaries of the Israelites, woven into the fabric of biblical history in ways that kept their name alive even when their empire was forgotten. Consider the story of Abraham purchasing a burial plot for his wife Sarah from Ephron the Hittite, a tale that appears in the book of Genesis. This simple transaction, recorded in careful detail, preserves a moment of human interaction across cultures and centuries. The biblical Abraham speaks respectfully with Ephron, negotiating the purchase of the cave of Machpelah with the dignity befitting two men of standing in their communities. This story, told in synagogues and churches for millennia, kept the Hittite name alive in human memory, even during the long centuries when their empire lay buried beneath Turkish soil. There's something deeply moving about how for many years, critics of the Bible treated the Hittites as proof of the mythology contained in the Bible, reasoning that since they had no archaeological evidence of a Hittite civilization, it must never have existed. The irony is profound. The very text that preserved their memory was doubted because physical evidence of their existence had been lost. It wasn't until the archaeological discoveries, beginning in 1876, that the biblical references were vindicated, showing how oral and written traditions can sometimes preserve historical truths that material evidence has obscured. In these biblical narratives, the Hittites appear as a people with their own distinct identity, sometimes as individuals with names and personalities. Uriah the Hittite, the loyal soldier whose tragic fate became entangled with King David's story, represents perhaps the most humanized Hittite figure in ancient literature. His character embodies honor and duty, qualities that have resonated with readers across cultures and centuries, dot the transition from biblical mention to modern. Imagination has been gradual but fascinating. As the 19th and 20th centuries brought archaeological discoveries that confirmed the historical existence of the Hittite Empire, writers and artists began to see them not just as minor biblical characters, but as representatives of a sophisticated ancient civilization worthy of exploration. In their own right, modern literature has embraced the Hittites with particular enthusiasm. Novels like Ben Bova's The Hittite and Janet E. Morris's I, the Sun, have brought Hittite characters and settings to contemporary audiences, weaving historical research into compelling narratives that make the ancient world accessible to modern readers. These works represent a fascinating collaboration between archaeological scholarship and literary imagination, where clay tablets become the foundation for epic tales of love, war, and political intrigue. The appeal of the Hittites to modern storytellers lies partly in their position as a civilization that was both historically significant and relatively unknown to general audiences. Unlike Egypt or Rome, which have been extensively portrayed in popular culture, the Hittites offer writers a chance to explore an ancient world that feels both authentic and fresh. Their rediscovery in the 20th century means they carry an air of mystery and revelation that resonates with contemporary sensibilities. In historical fiction, works like Joanne Williamson's Hittite Warrior have introduced younger readers to this ancient civilization, often focusing on the human stories that unfold against the backdrop of great historical events. These narratives typically emphasize the universal themes of courage, loyalty, and the search for identity that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. The Hittites have also found their way into academic literature in ways that blur the line between scholarship and storytelling. Researchers writing about Hittite culture often adopt narrative techniques that bring their subjects to life, describing not just what happened, but how it might have felt to live through these ancient events. The careful reconstruction of daily life in Hittite society based on archaeological evidence and cuneiform texts, becomes a form of collective biography that honors both historical accuracy and human imagination. Contemporary artists have been drawn to Hittite imagery and themes as well. The distinctive art style of the Hittite reliefs, with their powerful figures and symbolic animals, has influenced modern sculptors and painters seeking to connect with ancient traditions of artistic expression. Museums displaying Hittite artifacts often note how visitors are struck by the immediacy and emotional power of these ancient works, suggesting that artistic communication can transcend the boundaries of time and culture. The archaeological romance of the Hittite discoveries has itself become a subject of modern storytelling. The image of scholars, like Hugo Winkler, uncovering tablets that had been buried for 3 millennia, captures the imagination in ways that speak to our deep human desire to recover lost knowledge and reconnect with our ancestral past. These stories of discovery often emphasize the patience and dedication required for archaeological work, celebrating the quiet heroism of scholars who spend their lives piecing together fragments of the past in the realm of popular culture. The Hittites represent a particular type of ancient mystery that appeals to modern audiences. Unlike civilizations that have left obvious monuments like pyramids or colosseums, the Hittites left behind primarily written records and the ruins of their capital city. This emphasis on words and documents rather than spectacular architecture creates a different kind of fascination, one that focuses on the interior lives and thoughts of ancient people rather than their monumental achievements. The digital age has created new opportunities for Hittite stories to reach wider audiences. Online communities of history enthusiasts share theories about Hittite society, debate the meanings of newly translated texts, and create their own fictional works inspired by Hittite themes. Educational websites and YouTube channels dedicated to ancient history have introduced the Hittites to millions of people who might never have encountered them. Through traditional academic channels, documentary filmmakers have found the Hittite story particularly compelling because it combines multiple elements that make for engaging viewing: archaeological mystery, international intrigue, and the human drama of rediscovery. The visual contrast between the harsh Anatolian landscape and the landscape, sophisticated artifacts uncovered there, creates a powerful backdrop for exploring themes of civilization, decline, and renewal. The Hittites have also become symbols in contemporary discussions about the nature of historical knowledge and the fragility of cultural memory. Their story serves as a reminder that entire civilizations can be forgotten and then rediscovered, that the past is not a fixed narrative, but an ongoing conversation between present and past. This theme resonates particularly strongly in an era when digital technology simultaneously makes information more accessible and more ephemeral. Modern fantasy literature has drawn inspiration from Hittite mythology and religious practices, incorporating their pantheon of gods and their distinctive cultural practices into fictional worlds that echo but don't directly copy the historical Hittites. These works suggest that the Hittite legacy extends beyond historical facts into the realm of archetypal human experiences and universal themes. The enduring appeal of the Hittites in modern imagination lies perhaps in their unique position as a civilization that was both historically significant and personally accessible. Their extensive written records allow us to hear individual voices from the past in ways that purely archaeological evidence cannot provide. When we read a Hittite king's letter to an Egyptian pharaoh, we encounter not just historical facts, but human personalities, complete with their fears, ambitions, and diplomatic strategies. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider how the Hittites have traveled through time, from the Bronze Age to the present day, carried forward by the power of human storytelling and imagination. They began as historical actors on the stage of the ancient world, became shadowy figures in religious texts, disappeared entirely from human memory for centuries, and then emerged again as subjects of modern literature and popular culture. Journey reminds us that the past is never truly past, that ancient voices can speak to modern hearts, and that the human capacity for storytelling ensures that no civilization is ever completely forgotten. In tomorrow's dreams, perhaps you'll encounter Hittite charioteers racing across Anatolian plains, or scribes carefully pressing cuneiform signs into clay tablets, or archaeologists brushing 3 millennia of dust from precious artifacts. Sleep now, and let the gentle wind that blows across the ruins of Hattusa carry you toward dreams where ancient and modern meet, where the voices of the past join the chorus of the present, and where the Hittites live on in the endless human story of memory, imagination, and wonder. The evening stars are beginning to appear above the Anatolian plateau now, the same constellations that watched over Hittite astronomers as they mapped the heavens and calculated the movements of celestial bodies 3,000 years ago tonight. As we reach the end of our journey through the forgotten empire of bronze and iron, let us allow the gentle darkness to settle around us like a soft blanket, carrying us toward the peaceful sleep that awaits at the conclusion of every story. Listen to the wind as it moves across the highland meadows where Hattusa once stood in all its ancient glory. It whispers through the gaps in the massive stone blocks that still mark the boundaries of what was once the greatest city in Anatolia. The wind carries no urgency now, no messages between royal courts, no dispatches from distant battlefields. It simply moves as wind has always moved, patient and eternal, indifferent to the rise and fall of human ambitions. In the growing twilight, imagine walking slowly through the ruins of the Hittite capital, your footsteps echoing softly on pathways that once knew the measured tread of imperial guards and the hurried pace of royal messengers. The great walls still rise around you, though time has weathered their surfaces and wild grasses have found purchase in the spaces between ancient stones. These walls once enclosed a world of power and ceremony, of scribes bent over clay tablets, and priests performing rituals to ensure the favor of distant gods. The famous Lion Gate stands silhouetted against the darkening sky, its carved guardians still watching over approaches that no longer lead to a living city. For 3 millennia, these stone lions have maintained their vigil through the long winter snows and the dry summers, through the centuries when no human foot disturbed the silence of the abandoned streets. They have become symbols not just of Hittite power, but of the enduring nature of artistic creation, of humanity's drive to leave permanent marks upon the world. As darkness deepens, the ruins seem to breathe with memory. Here, in the royal quarter, kings once held court and received ambassadors from Egypt and Babylon. The throne room where Muwatalli II planned his strategy for the Battle of Kadesh is now open to the sky, its roof beams long since turned to dust. Yet something of its dignity remains, something that speaks of the weight of responsibility carried by those who ruled an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Euphrates. The temple complexes scattered throughout the city remind us that the Hittites understood themselves as participants in a cosmic order larger than any earthly kingdom. Their gods of storm and sun, of mountains and rivers, demanded constant attention and careful ritual observance. The ceremonies performed here connected the human world to divine realms, ensuring that the cycles of seasons continued, that rains fell when needed, that the kingdom prospered under heavenly protection. In the gentle starlight, we can almost see the archive rooms where thousands of clay tablets once rested in careful order, each one a voice from the past, waiting to speak to future generations. These repositories of knowledge contained not just the official records of empire, but the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had learned to balance military strength with diplomatic finesse, royal authority with legal protections for common people. The residential quarters spread out below the royal precincts tell their own quieter stories. Here lived the craftsmen who worked iron into tools and weapons, the merchants who organized trade caravans to distant markets, the farmers who supplied grain to feed the city's population. Their homes, though simpler than the palaces, were built with the same careful attention to stone working that characterized all Hittite architecture. These people understood themselves as citizens of something greater than their individual lives, participants in a civilizational project that connected them to both past and future. As the night grows deeper, the silence becomes profound. This is not the empty silence of abandonment, but the full silence of completion, of a story that has been told to its natural end. The Hittites achieved what they set out to achieve. They built an empire that lasted for centuries, developed technologies that changed the ancient world, created legal codes that influenced subsequent civilizations, and left behind a written record that allows their voices to speak across the millennia. Their empire fell, as all empires must, but their legacy endures in ways both obvious and subtle. The iron-working techniques they pioneered spread throughout the ancient world, ushering in the Iron Age that transformed human civilization. Their diplomatic innovations, particularly the concept of formal peace treaties between equal powers, established precedents that continue to influence international relations today. Their legal traditions, with their emphasis on proportional punishment and protection for the vulnerable, contributed to the development of legal systems that still shape our world. The rediscovery of Hittite civilization in the 20th century reminds us that human knowledge is never complete, that there are always new chapters waiting to be uncovered and new voices waiting to be heard. The patient work of archaeologists and linguists who decoded the cuneiform tablets demonstrates that curiosity and persistence can recover what seemed permanently lost. Their success offers hope that other forgotten civilizations may yet emerge from the earth to enrich our understanding of the human past. In the deep quiet of this Anatolian night, we can sense the presence of all those who walked these paths before us. The kings and queens who bore the weight of empire, the soldiers who defended distant frontiers, the scribes who preserved the records we can still read today, the common people who lived their lives with dignity and purpose within the framework of Hittite civilization. They are not gone. They live on in the stories we tell about them, in the technologies they developed, in the legal and diplomatic principles they established. The wind that moves through the ruins tonight connects us to that ancient world. It is the same wind that dried the clay tablets as scribes pressed cuneiform signs into their surfaces, the same wind that cooled the forge fires where smiths worked iron into revolutionary new tools and weapons. It carries the continuity that links all human experience across time, reminding us that we are part of a story much larger than our individual lives. As your eyes grow heavy and sleep begins to call, let the peace of this ancient place settle into your heart. The Hittites accomplished their work in the world. They built, they created, they preserved what was valuable and passed it on to future generations. Their kingdom of stone may lie in ruins, but their contributions to human civilization remain solid and enduring as the massive blocks that still mark the boundaries of their capital city. Rest now in the knowledge that human achievements, even when they seem to disappear, have a way of returning when the time is right. The voices that were silent for 3,000 years found a way to speak again through the patient work of scholars who refused to let the past remain buried. The technologies that seemed lost were rediscovered and improved. The wisdom that appeared forgotten proved to have been preserved in texts that waited for the right readers to unlock their secrets. Sleep peacefully under the same stars that watched over the Hittite Empire, secure in the understanding that you are part of an ongoing human story that stretches back to the very beginnings of civilization and forward into a future filled with possibilities we cannot yet imagine. The gentle wind of Anatolia carries blessing from the ancient world to the modern, a whispered reminder that all human striving, all acts of creation and preservation contribute to the great tapestry of our shared experience. in your dreams. Tonight, may you walk through the gardens of Hattusa when they were green and flourishing. May you hear the ring of hammer on anvil in the workshops where iron was first shaped into tools of progress. May you sense the satisfaction of the scribes as they completed their careful records, knowing that their words would outlast their bodies and carry their civilization's voice across the centuries. The night veil falls gently over the stone kingdom now, and in that gentle darkness, the Hittites rest in the peace of accomplishment, their work complete, their stories told, their legacy secure in the endless human memory that preserves all that is truly valuable from our shared past. Sleep well, and let their peace become your peace, their rest become your rest. Their dreams of ancient Anatolia become the gentle dreams that carry you into restorative slumber.